Hi guys, tonight we step quietly into a winter that does not announce itself with drama, but with a slow tightening around a frontier home. You are standing just outside a rough-built house as dusk leans in the air, already sharpening your breath. Smoke hangs low and smells of resin and last year's wood. Snow is not falling yet, which somehow feels worse. The cold is settling patient, deliberate, like it knows you personally. And here is the uncomfortable truth right up front. You probably would not survive this if you treated winter, the way most of us do now, as background noise instead of an active threat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights and let your shoulders drop as the story carries you forward. You are not thinking of winter as a season yet. Out here, winter behaves more like a living presence. Frontier families did not wait for snow to declare it had arrived. They felt it first in the way sound carried farther at dusk, in how the ground stiffened underfoot, in the faint metallic taste the air left on your tongue. The cold announces itself quietly, and that quiet is exactly why it is dangerous. You can hear the house creak as temperatures fall, wood contracting, joints tightening. Inside, someone shifts a kettle closer to the hearth without comment. This is not panic. This is recognition. A widely accepted historical reality is that many frontier deaths attributed to cold did not happen during blizzards or record-breaking freezes. They happened on ordinary nights when families underestimated how quickly conditions could turn. That fact alone changes how you listen to the wind brushing the walls now. Cold was never just about discomfort. It was about margins. A small misjudgment could follow you for weeks. You step inside, and the first thing you notice is not warmth. It is the absence of movement. The air feels heavier, almost held in place. Frontier homes were built to slow the cold, not defeat it. Insulation was improvised, layered, and constantly adjusted. Cracks were stuffed with cloth or mud. Doors were weighted, not sealed tight, because some airflow mattered. You can smell damp wool drying near the fire and the faint sour note of stored root vegetables beneath it. The cold is outside, but it is negotiating its way in. There is a strange comfort in how ordinary this all feels. No one is dramatizing the weather. No one is staring out the window in fear. That calm is learned. Families on the frontier understood that winter punished emotional reactions as much as physical mistakes. You breathe slowly, copying their pace. Your fingers tingle not painfully yet, but enough to remind you they exist. That awareness is information. Here is a curious detail you might not expect. Some frontier families deliberately let indoor temperatures drop at night instead of feeding the fire constantly. The reasoning was simple and slightly counterintuitive. A roaring fire dried the air too much, increasing heat loss from skin and lungs. A steadier, lower heat conserved fuel and reduced drafts. It feels wrong to modern instincts, but it worked often enough to become habit. Scholars still debate whether this restraint was primarily about fuel scarcity or about a deeper experiential understanding of how cold interacted with the human body. Either way, the result was the same. People learned to live alongside cold rather than fight it outright. You move deeper into the room and notice how everything has a place, not neatly, but intentionally. Boots are set where they can breathe without freezing solid. A bench blocks a draft near the door. Tools lean close to reach, not because danger is expected, but because searching costs energy. The cold turns inefficiency into risk. Even now you feel how moving too quickly makes you colder, not warmer. Your breath quickens, moisture building where you do not want it. You slow down. Outside, the wind shifts, testing the structure. You hear it slide along the wall, then lift away, dissatisfied. That sound tells you something important. The house is holding, at least for now. Frontier families listened to their homes the way sailors listen to ships. Every noise meant something. Silence meant something too, but that comes later. One mainstream fact that often surprises people is how rarely frontier families relied on thermometers. Many did not own one, and those who did often trusted their senses more. They judged cold by how fast water skinned over with ice, how breath hung in the air, how animals behaved. Numbers mattered less than patterns. You realize how disconnected that feels from modern life, and yet how calming it is to rely on direct observation. There is also a quirky piece of winter wisdom passed quietly through generations. Some families rubbed a thin layer of animal fat on exposed skin before severe cold. Not as insulation, but as a wind barrier. It smelled faintly unpleasant and felt greasy, but it reduced frost damage. No one wrote proud journal entries about this. It was simply done. You settle near the fire, not close enough to sweat, just close enough to feel steady. The light flickers softly, shadows moving like slow thoughts along the walls. Outside night is fully arrived now. You are not afraid of it, but you respect it. That respect is the theme that will follow you through everything that comes next. As you sit here, listening to the low sounds of a winter evening, you begin to understand something essential. Cold was never an enemy that could be defeated once and for all. It was a condition to be managed moment by moment. Frontier families survived not because they were tougher, but because they paid attention. You feel that attention settling into you now, easing your breathing, slowing your thoughts, preparing you to notice what matters. The house creaks again, softly, like a reminder rather than a warning. You lean back, letting the rhythm of this older world carry you forward, knowing that winter has only just begun to speak. You remain where you are, letting the warmth level out instead of chasing it. Outside, winter continues its quiet approach, and now you start to notice how much information exists before the first real snow ever falls. Frontier families did not wait for a storm to tell them what was coming. They read winter the way you read a familiar face in low light, by small changes that add up. You step closer to the door and pause, listening. The sound of the wind has shifted again, flatter now, less playful. That alone would have told an experienced settler to adjust plans for the next day. You learn that winter rarely arrived as a surprise to those who survived it well. A broadly accepted historical reality is that frontier families often altered travel work schedules and even meals several days before major cold events. This was not superstition. It was pattern recognition. The sky held a different colour at dusk, a washed-out steel tone instead of blue. Smoke from chimneys failed to rise and instead pressed downward, spreading low across the land. Even your ears picked it up the way distant sounds carried farther, sharper, then suddenly dulled. You step outside again briefly, just long enough to feel the air on your face. It is heavier now, pressing inward rather than moving past you. Animals notice this long before people do. Chickens settle earlier than usual. Dogs circle twice instead of once before lying down. Horses shift their weight and angle their bodies away from open ground. None of this is dramatic, but together it forms a clear message. Cold is not rushing in, it is positioning itself. There is a curious, almost forgotten habit recorded in several frontier diaries. Some families scattered ash or fine soil in shallow pans and left them outside overnight. In the morning, the pattern of frost across the surface revealed wind direction and moisture changes better than any spoken forecast. It sounds oddly scientific for people often described as simple, and yet it worked often enough to be remembered. You imagine checking those pans at dawn fingertips, learning what kind of day you were waking into. Historians still argue whether this level of environmental awareness was common knowledge, or whether it developed only among families who endured repeated losses. Either way, those who learned it treated winter as something to negotiate with, not something to ignore until it became unavoidable. You can feel how that mindset changes everything. Preparation is no longer anxiety, it becomes routine. Inside the house again, someone adjusts a shutter without speaking. Light narrows, heat steadies. These movements are small, almost unconscious, but they are guided by what was observed outside hours earlier. That is another mainstream truth often missed. Frontier life rewarded anticipation more than reaction. Waiting until cold felt dangerous meant you were already behind. You notice the smell of the air inside has changed too. Less damp now, more resin and smoke. That means fuel is burning efficiently. A poor burn on a cold night was a warning sign. It meant moisture in the wood-clogged airflow, or bad draft, all problems that became serious once temperatures dropped further. You listen to the fire the way someone else might listen to weather reports, noting its steadiness, the pitch of its crackle. A quirky seasonal trick surfaces here as well. Some families hung thin strips of dried meat or cloth near doorways, not for storage but as wind indicators. If they stirred without the door opening, it meant a leak had formed. That leak would be stuffed before night fully set in. It seems almost childlike, but it was practical, and it saved energy that would otherwise bleed away unnoticed. You realise how different this is from modern forecasting. There is no single moment where winter begins. It seeps in through clues layered over days. The cold speaks softly first. You are learning to listen. As night deepens, the stars sharpen overhead, brighter than earlier, which seems beautiful but carries meaning too. Clear skies after a pressure drop often signalled harder cold ahead. Frontier families took that seriously. Extra fuel might be brought closer. Water containers shifted inward, so ice would form slower. Clothing laid out in sequences rather than piles because fumbling in the morning cost warmth. You stand still for a moment, breathing slowly, letting this awareness settle. Nothing about this feels frantic. It feels methodical, almost calming. The cold has rules. Those who learned them slept better. There is an old saying recorded in several winter journals, repeated in different words. The storm tells you it is coming if you bother to watch. Miss the message, and it stops being polite. You smile faintly at how true that still feels. The house creaks again, a little deeper now. Somewhere nearby, an animal shifts, then settles. You know without thinking too hard that the night will be colder than the last. Not dangerous yet, but demanding respect. You move with that knowledge, guiding you, making small adjustments that will matter hours from now. Winter has not arrived in force, but it has introduced itself. And now that you recognize its voice, you are far less likely to be caught off guard. You move through the house slowly, noticing details that felt invisible at first. Frontier homes were never meant to conquer winter. They were meant to negotiate with it, and that negotiation is written into every beam corner and low ceiling. You run your hand along a log wall and feel how uneven it is, how gaps have been packed and repacked over time. This is not poor craftsmanship, it is adaptive design. The house has been listening to winter longer than you have. A commonly accepted historical fact is that frontier families built for wind control before anything else. Snow could be managed, cold could be layered against. Wind was the real thief. It reached through clothing, pulled heat from skin, and turned tolerable temperatures into lethal ones. That is why windows are small, often fewer than you expect. That is why doors rarely face open ground. Houses angle themselves slightly, shoulders turned away from prevailing gusts, like a person bracing against a shove. You notice how the ceiling hangs lower than modern homes. Heat does not have far to rise before it pools and settles. Sleeping platforms sit higher off the floor, not for comfort, but because cold air sinks. Even now you can feel it at your ankles, a thin layer of sharper chill that reminds you where not to linger. The house teaches you where to exist within it. You step toward the back wall where the light barely reaches. There is earth packed tight behind the logs. Some frontier families deliberately built into hillsides or piled soil against exterior walls. These sod-backed homes looked crude from the outside, but they behaved beautifully in winter. Earth does not warm quickly, but it does not cool quickly either. It buffered temperature swings, smoothing out the violence of night cold and midday thaw. People notice the difference immediately. There is a fringe detail that feels almost too clever to be true, and yet it appears in several accounts. Some families layered birch bark, or even old newspapers between log courses, not for insulation alone, but to manage moisture. Dampness robbed warmth faster than cold air. Keeping walls dry mattered as much as keeping them thick. You imagine fingers inky from old print stuffing yesterday's news into tomorrow's shelter. Historians still argue whether these techniques spread through shared knowledge, or whether families independently arrived at similar solutions under pressure. What is clear is that survival selected for certain designs. Homes that failed taught lessons harshly. Homes that worked were copied quietly, without ceremony. You sit for a moment and listen. The house sounds different now that night has settled fully. Small pops from contracting wood echo softly, not alarming, but informative. Experienced settlers could tell how fast temperatures were dropping by these sounds alone. Too rapid, and adjustments were made. A shutter tightened, a fire banked differently. Awareness never slept completely. You notice how furniture placement matters. A table blocks a draft path. A chest sits against a seam in the wall. Nothing is accidental. Even clutter has purpose. Modern minimalism would feel dangerous here. Empty space invites air movement, and air movement invites heat loss. The house prefers to feel full. A quirky but telling habit emerges here too. Some frontier families hung heavy quilts or hides along interior walls at night, then removed them during the day. This allowed moisture to evaporate, while still trapping warmth when it mattered most. It required effort, yes, but it extended the life of both shelter and occupants. You imagine the quiet rustle of fabric each evening, a soft ritual marking the boundary between day and night. You stand and move closer to the hearth. The fire is not roaring, it is steady, low breathing. That tells you the house is doing its job. When shelter works, fire does not need to struggle. That was understood without equations or charts. It was felt in the body. One often overlooked mainstream truth is that frontier homes were rarely finished. They evolved. Walls thickened over years, openings narrowed, roof lines changed. Winter shaped architecture incrementally, not according to blueprints, but according to feedback. If a corner stayed cold, no matter what, it was altered. If snow piled dangerously, the angle shifted next season. You run your fingers along a window frame and feel where cloth has been tucked into the edges. Glass was expensive and fragile. Some families used oiled paper instead, which diffused light but blocked wind surprisingly well. It sounds primitive until you consider how much warmth a draft can steal. You press your palm there and feel nothing moving. That is success. There is a quiet satisfaction in realizing that this house is not fragile. It looks rough, but it is tuned. It knows winter. It has been wrong before and corrected itself. You feel safer because of that, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow easing of tension you did not realize you were holding. Outside, wind tests the walls again, then slides away. Snow will come later. For now, the house stands ready, breathing slowly, conserving heat the way a careful body conserves energy. You match its pace without thinking. Your movements soften, your thoughts slow. You begin to understand that frontier wisdom lived less in heroic moments and more in these quiet adjustments. Homes were teachers. They instructed families every night if people listened. And as you sit there now, surrounded by wood earth and layered in tension, you feel that lesson settling into you, too steady and calm, ready to carry you into the deeper cold ahead. You begin to notice something subtle that frontier families learned the hard way. Snow looks dramatic, even beautiful, but it was rarely the true problem. Drafts were. Moving air was the quiet predator that slipped through every mistake. You stand still long enough to feel it, that faint thread of cold that snakes along the floor or brushes the back of your neck. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply steals warmth and leaves you wondering why you feel tired sooner than expected. People living through those winters discovered through repetition, rather than theory, that still air could be tolerated at temperatures that moving air made dangerous. Many cold weather fatalities recorded in settlement ledgers occurred during relatively mild freezes paired with steady wind. That realization reshaped daily behavior. Blocking airflow became more important than chasing higher temperatures. You feel that logic settle in as you shift slightly, placing your body where the air feels quieter. You notice how doorways are treated almost like wounds that must be dressed carefully. Extra cloth hangs nearby. Wooden bars press doors tighter at night. Even then, no one assumes a perfect seal. Instead, people learned where the air preferred to travel and worked around it. A bench placed just so. A bundle of stored grain sacks stacked along a seam. You can almost map the drafts by instinct now, like reading an invisible current. There is an odd detail passed down in some family stories that feels almost playful. Children were sometimes told to watch candle flames placed near walls and corners. If the flame leaned or trembled without explanation, it revealed a leak. This was not framed as a lesson, it was a game. But the result was serious. Those leaks were stuffed before night fell. You imagine a child crouched in the dim light, eyes fixed on a flicker, unknowingly protecting the household. Researchers have long discussed whether frontier people truly understood the science behind heat transfer, or whether they simply reacted to what worked. The debate matters less when you feel the result. A draft brushes your ankle again, and you instinctively step away. That movement is wisdom, not fear. You sit down and notice how furniture placement matters just as much as walls. Beds are rarely pushed against exterior surfaces. Tables block paths where cold air would otherwise spill freely. Even storage chests serve double duty, holding goods and anchoring warmth. Nothing feels random. The house is arranged like a puzzle solved over years of winter nights. One well-established observation from period accounts is that people often felt colder indoors during windy days than during calm, snowy ones, even when thermometers suggested the opposite. Snow muffled airflow. Wind amplified it. You feel that truth in your bones now. Outside you can hear the breeze skimming along the walls, but inside it passes without grabbing hold. That tells you the barriers are doing their job. A lesser-known practice involved floor coverings layered in deliberate sequences, straw beneath woven mats, hides on top, not for softness but to interrupt air movement rising from the ground. Cold crept upward invisibly, and feet paid the price first. You shift your toes slightly and feel how much warmer they are, where the layers thicken. That small comfort matters more than you might think. Some scholars continue to question how widespread this awareness was beyond experienced families. Did newcomers learn quickly, or did the land teach harsh lessons first? Diaries suggest both. Those who adapted lived long enough to pass knowledge quietly. Those who did not often disappeared from records altogether. You breathe slowly, noticing how your own body responds when drafts fade. Muscles relax, breathing deepens, the sense of urgency softens. Frontier families understood this connection, even if they never named it. Calm conserved heat, anxiety burned it. You stand and walk toward the center of the room, where air feels stillest. This is where people naturally gathered at night, not out of sentiment, but physics. Heat pooled where bodies and barriers work together. The room feels smaller now, but safer. There is a strangely modern echo in all this. Today we talk about insulation values and air sealing. Back then, people talked about how a room felt at dusk. They trusted that feeling. It guided decisions more reliably than numbers ever could. The wind outside presses once more, then eases. You do not flinch. You know where it will go and where it will fail. That confidence is earned through attention, not bravado. Drafts taught frontier families humility. They also taught precision. As you settle again, you realize how much effort goes into making winter feel uneventful. Comfort is not the absence of work. It is the result of countless small corrections. You feel yourself absorbing that lesson, letting it slow you steady. You prepare you for the deeper routines still ahead. The house breathes quietly, around you holding still air close like a secret. And for now, that is enough. You turn your attention fully to the fire now, because on the frontier, it was never just a source of comfort. It was more like a conversation that needed constant listening. A fire that was too loud meant waste. A fire that went quiet too quickly meant danger. You crouch slightly, feeling the heat on your face but not your knees, and you understand why people said they learned to read flames the way others read faces. Fireplaces were treated less like appliances and more like living systems. One well-recognized historical reality is that many families banked their fires carefully at night, rather than letting them blaze. Coals were arranged, ash was pulled just so, and larger logs were positioned to burn slowly inward. The goal was not brightness, it was endurance. A fire that lasted until morning even weakly saved fingers, fuel and time. You notice how the sound matters as much as the heat. A steady low murmur means the draft is correct. Sharp snapping suggests resin pockets or airflow problems. Too much roar means heat is racing up the chimney instead of staying in the room. You listen without thinking and your body responds. You ease back a step. You feel when it is right. There is a strange, almost poetic detail tucked into some frontier letters. People wrote about fires that sulked or fires that behaved. This was not metaphor for drama. It was shorthand for performance. A sulking fire smoked, wasted fuel, and chilled rooms. A well-behaved one burned clean and slow. You imagine someone muttering softly to the hearth, adjusting a log like calming an animal. Those hearths were built differently, depending on region and experience. Some chimneys were deliberately narrow to increase draw in calm conditions. Others included rough stone interiors that slowed airflow during high winds. These variations were not planned by architects. They emerged through trial and error, sometimes across generations. A poorly designed hearth taught brutal lessons. A curious and less discussed habit involved keeping a small collection of oddly sized firewood pieces. Not everything was cut uniform. Thin splits revived sluggish coals. Knotted chunks slowed an overeager flame. Fire management was less about quantity and more about control. You picture hands selecting wood by feel, even in low light, knowing exactly what the fire needed. Specialists still debate how much of this knowledge was consciously taught versus absorbed through observation. Did children receive direct instruction, or did they simply grow into it by watching adults adjust fires every evening? The sources suggest both. What matters is that the skill became second nature. You feel that happening now as you sit longer, listening more closely. You notice how the fire shapes the room socially as well. People gather near it, but not crowding. Too close means sweating, which becomes dangerous once you move away. Too far means chilled muscles. There is a sweet spot where warmth stabilizes the body without making it lazy. Frontier families learned that balance intuitively. You find yourself leaning into that same distance. There is also the matter of smell. Clean burning wood smells sharp and pleasant. A sour note signals damp fuel. That smell carried meaning. Damp wood wasted heat and filled lungs with moisture, laden smoke increasing cold, stress. Some families dried fuel indoors days ahead, stacking it carefully so it warmed without igniting. This was another quiet ritual, marking the approach of deep winter. One documented observation from settlement records is that households with better fire management reported fewer cold-related illnesses, even when their shelters were otherwise similar. The fire did more than warm the air. It dried clothing, stabilized breathing, and created predictable routines. That predictability mattered as much as temperature. There is a peculiar tidbit that sounds almost like folklore. In especially harsh weather, some families placed flat stones or bricks near the hearth to absorb heat, then moved them closer to beds at night. These were not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to soften the cold. It was crude heat storage, but effective. You imagine the quiet thump of stone being shifted after dark. As you sit there, you realize how fire demanded humility. You could not force it to obey. You could only work with its tendencies. Push too hard, and it punished you by consuming fuel too fast. Neglect it, and it withdrew completely. That relationship shaped behavior. People moved slower, spoke softer, paid attention. The firelight flickers against the walls, revealing textures you missed earlier. Tool marks, old repairs, layers of soot marking past winters. This hearth has been wrong before and corrected. That history lives in its stones. You lean back and feel how your breathing syncs with the rhythm of the flames. Slow, even, economical. Frontier families understood that stillness conserved heat better than restless movement. Fires rewarded patience. There is something reassuring in knowing that warmth came not from abundance, but from understanding. You did not need endless fuel, you needed skill. That truth softened fear. Winter became demanding, but not mysterious. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, the fire holds, steady, low, and reliable. You feel your muscles loosen, your thoughts lengthen. The hearth continues its quiet conversation, and you are finally fluent enough to listen without effort. You start thinking about fuel, now not as an abstract supply, but as a timeline. On the frontier, warmth was never something you decided about in the moment. It was the result of choices made months earlier, sometimes seasons earlier, when the air was still warm and winter felt theoretical. You picture stacks of wood laid carefully long before the first frost, each piece placed with an understanding of how long the cold could linger. A well-established truth from settlement records is that fuel shortages caused more suffering than sudden storms. Families who misjudged how much they would need rarely failed all at once. They failed gradually, burning the wrong pieces too early, rationing poorly, then facing the hardest weeks with nothing left but desperation. Fuel was time made solid. Once spent, it could not be replaced easily. You imagine walking the land in late summer, evaluating trees not for beauty, but for future warmth. Deadfall was preferred already dried by sun and air. Green wood was cut only with planning split, early stacked to season properly. Some families marked their piles by year, knowing exactly which stack would burn cleanest in January. This kind of foresight feels foreign now, but it was once ordinary. There is a lesser-known detail that feels almost clever in its restraint. In regions where trees were scarce, families turned to alternatives without hesitation. Dried animal dung, packed and stored carefully, burned slowly and evenly. It smelled faintly unpleasant, but it worked. Crop waste, corn cobs, even twisted prairie grasses became fuel. Nothing combustible was dismissed outright. Warmth demanded creativity. Scholars continue to examine how fuel strategies differed between regions and cultures. Some argue that scarcity sharpened innovation, while others suggest that abundance bred waste that later proved fatal. What is clear is that people learned quickly when their assumptions failed. Winter offered no second chances. You notice how fuel is stored close but not too close. Wood stacked near the house warms and dries, but if it is too near, snowdrift and dampness undo the benefit. Some families built simple lean-tos or covered racks angled to shed snow while catching sun. The design was rarely pretty, but it was effective. A dry log weighed less, burned hotter, and lasted longer. That difference mattered on the coldest nights. You run your hand over a piece of firewood and feel the texture. Cracks mean it is ready. A dull thud when knocked together signals moisture still trapped inside. People learned these cues by feel and sound, not measurement. You smile slightly at how tactile this knowledge is. It lives in hands, not books. There is a small, almost humorous habit mentioned in a few winter accounts. Some families kept a secret reserve of fuel, hidden away not to hoard selfishly, but to protect against their own optimism. They knew how easy it was to underestimate winter. That hidden stack was insurance against miscalculation. You imagine the quiet relief of knowing it existed, untouched, waiting. One mainstream observation, often overlooked, is how fuel gathering shaped daily life long before winter arrived. Summer days were punctuated by splitting and stacking. Children carried armfuls of kindling as casually as toys. These tasks were not framed as chores alone. They were investments. Each log stacked was a future night made safer. You also realize how fuel choices influenced fire behavior. Hardwoods burned longer and steadier, ideal for night. Softer woods flared quickly, useful for morning revival. Mixing them required judgment. Burn the wrong combination, and you wasted heat or woke cold. Families learned these patterns intimately. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how communal fuel sharing worked during severe winters. Some records suggest neighbours pooled resources, while others show strict boundaries. Likely both happened depending on circumstance. Trust and proximity mattered. Winter tested relationships as much as supplies. You sit back and picture the slow rhythm of preparation. The sound of an axe in warm air, the smell of fresh split wood, the satisfaction of straight stacks rising against a wall. These were not romantic gestures. They were acts of survival, performed calmly, methodically. As the night stretches on, you understand how fuel planning softened fear. Knowing tomorrow's fire was already waiting allowed people to sleep more deeply. Anxiety burns warmth faster than cold ever could. You glance toward this hearth again, feeling gratitude for the quiet heat it offers. Every flame here represents hours of work done long ago. That connection between past effort and present comfort feels grounding. Winter still presses outside, patient and heavy. Inside, warmth endures because someone respected time enough to prepare. You let that thought settle, slowing your breathing, easing your mind, ready to drift into the next layer of frontier wisdom, waiting just ahead. You begin to pay attention to clothing, not as something you wear, but as something you inhabit. On the frontier, garments were systems assembled with the same care as walls and roofs. You feel how each layer behaves as you shift near the fire. Too close, and sweat threatens. Too far, and stiffness creeps in. The goal was never to feel hot. It was to stay dry, flexible, and steady. A commonly recognized reality from winter journals is that people dressed with moisture in mind before warmth. Wool sat closest to the skin because it kept insulating even when damp. Linen appeared where you might expect heavier cloth because it wicked moisture away without clinging. Hides and furs faced outward, breaking wind and shedding snow. This order mattered. Reverse it and the body lost heat quickly. You tug a sleeve slightly and feel the fabric breathe. You notice how nothing fits tightly. Air is trapped deliberately thin layers of stillness held between cloth and skin. Movement compresses some pockets and opens others, creating circulation without drafts. It is architecture in motion. People learned this through cold hands and colder mornings, adjusting cut and size until garments worked with the body rather than against it. There is a small but striking detail buried in several personal accounts. Some families deliberately roughened the inner surface of wool garments with brushes or pumice. This created tiny air pockets that improved insulation. It ruined the look, but no one cared. Beauty lost arguments with physics every time. You imagine fingers scratching fabric by lamplight, improving tomorrow without ceremony. Researchers still discuss how much of this knowledge came from European traditions versus local adaptation. Immigrants arrived with assumptions about clothing that sometimes failed brutally in new climates. Over time, garments changed, sleeves widened, collars grew higher, layers multiplied. The land edited fashion ruthlessly. You shift your weight and feel the difference between damp and dry. Even slight moisture chills faster than you expect. Frontier families understood this viscerally. They avoided sweating during work, even in cold, by pacing themselves and venting layers briefly. It feels counterintuitive, but it worked. Sweat trapped under insulation became ice later. A peculiar but effective habit involved changing socks more often than any other garment. Dry feet preserved morale as much as circulation. Some people carried spare socks inside their clothing during the day, using body heat to dry them gradually. It sounds uncomfortable, but it prevented worse outcomes. You picture the faint smell of wool warming slowly, a quiet promise of comfort later. One widely observed truth in settlement records is how quickly clothing failures cascaded. A wet cuff led to stiff fingers. Stiff fingers delayed tasks. Delays burned more energy. Winter punished sequences, not single mistakes. That is why clothing routines were conservative, even cautious. People dressed for what might happen, not what felt comfortable now. There is a fringe detail that feels almost charming. Children were sometimes dressed in intentionally oversized garments, not to save money, but to allow for layering and growth through winter. Extra fabric meant extra air. Extra air meant warmth. Practicality disguised as generosity. Some historians continue to question how early settlers learned to distrust certain fabrics so completely. Cotton, for example, absorbed moisture readily and lost insulating value almost entirely when wet. Many newcomers arrived wearing it proudly. Few kept trusting it after their first cold season. Experience corrected theory swiftly. You become aware of how dressing was tied to routine. Clothes were laid out in specific orders at night, so dressing in the morning wasted no warmth. Shirts warmed near the fire. Boots dried but not overheated. Mittens tucked inside sleeves. These sequences reduced fumbling, which reduced exposure. Morning cold was not fought, it was anticipated. You lift your hands and feel how mittens differ from gloves. Fingers share warmth instead of isolating. Dexterity was sacrificed for endurance. People accepted this trade willingly. Tasks were adapted, tools modified. Survival preferred simplicity. There is also the matter of repair. Clothing was mended constantly, often before, damage seemed serious. A loose seam became a wind tunnel. A worn elbow leaked heat. Fixing these early was easier than enduring their consequences. You imagine quiet evenings, spent stitching by firelight, not out of thrift alone, but foresight. As you sit, you feel how layers settle, each one doing its job without demanding attention. That is the mark of good design. Frontier clothing was successful when it disappeared from awareness, allowing focus to remain on listening, watching, conserving. Outside, the cold presses steadily. Inside, your body holds warmth efficiently, not through excess but through balance. You realize how modern clothing often aims to impress rather than cooperate. Out here, cooperation kept people alive. You lean back slightly and let your shoulders relax. The weight of layers feels reassuring now, like a quiet embrace rather than a burden. Winter remains demanding, but you are dressed to meet it without drama. That calm readiness carries you forward, guiding your movements, slowing your thoughts, preparing you for the next lessons that emerge once night deepens and rest becomes the most important task of all. You become aware of a quiet danger that frontier families learn to respect, without ever naming dramatically. Cotton. It looks harmless, soft, familiar, yet in cold weather it behaved like a traitor. You feel how moisture lingers in fabric when you breathe or move, and you understand why certain materials earned mistrust over time. Cold did not forgive comfort based on habit. A well-documented reality from settlement accounts is that people wearing cotton garments in winter suffered more cold-related injuries than those layered in wool or linen. This was not obvious at first. Cotton felt pleasant indoors and dried quickly near fire. Outside, once damp, it clung and stripped heat rapidly. Families learned this lesson slowly, and sometimes painfully, and once learned, it spread quietly through communities. You imagine the moment of realization. A shirt that felt fine at dusk becomes a cold weight by midnight. Fingers numb faster than expected. Fatigue arrives early. No blizzard, no drama. Just a creeping failure that makes simple tasks feel heavy. That experience changed wardrobes permanently. There is an oddly specific habit mentioned in a few personal letters. Some settlers tested fabrics by pressing them against snow or ice briefly, then feeling how quickly the cold transferred. Wool resisted, linen cooled but released moisture. Cotton shocked the skin and held the chill. This was not scientific testing, but it was convincing enough to alter choices. You picture someone kneeling in snow sleeves rolled, conducting this quiet experiment. Researchers still discuss whether cotton gained popularity, initially because of availability or because of cultural attachment carried from milder climates. Either way, winter corrected assumptions decisively. What worked in one place failed in another. The land became the final editor. You notice how frontier families rarely threw cotton away. Instead, it was reassigned. Summer wear, bedding layers away from skin, cleaning cloths, nothing wasted. But it was kept away from direct exposure to winter moisture. Knowledge did not erase the material, it repositioned it. There is a lesser known but clever adaptation that followed. Some people layered cotton between wool and outer hides, using it as a buffer rather than insulation. In that position, it absorbed moisture, migrating outward, protecting the inner layer. This required discipline and understanding. Placed wrong, it caused harm. Placed right, it extended comfort. You feel how precise these systems became. One broadly accepted observation from winter narratives is how quickly communities standardized around effective materials. Newcomers noticed patterns. Those who ignored them stood out. Cold enforced conformity more strictly than social pressure ever could. Warmth rewarded imitation. You sit still and reflect on how modern language still carries echoes of this lesson. The phrase "cotton kills" appears in outdoor culture today, stripped of its historical context. Back then, it was not a slogan. It was a conclusion reached through experience, whispered rather than shouted. Some scholars continue to debate how much this material wisdom originated from indigenous practices versus independent trial. Evidence suggests a mix. Native communities understood fabric behavior intimately and often advised settlers, though credit was rarely recorded. Over time, techniques blended quietly, leaving no clear boundary. You feel gratitude now for the layers you imagined earlier, each chosen for function rather than familiarity. Clothing becomes less about identity and more about agreement with environment. Winter respected that agreement. There is also an emotional dimension to this knowledge. Trusting the wrong material created anxiety. People woke uncertain, uncomfortable, restless. Trusting the right layers allowed sleep to come easier. The body relaxed when it knew it was protected. That peace mattered deeply. You shift slightly and feel how dryness stabilizes warmth. It is not dramatic. It is subtle, persistent. Frontier families learned to value that subtlety. They stopped chasing instant comfort and started investing in sustained balance. Outside, frost thickens invisibly. Inside, your imagined garments do their quiet work. No itching panic, no sudden chill, just steady warmth held gently in place. You realize how much of winter survival depended on unlearning habits. Letting go of what felt nice in favor of what worked, that humility saved lives. As you breathe slowly, letting this lesson settle, you sense the rhythm of frontier nights emerging more clearly. Attention, adjustment, restraint. These were the tools people carried when tools ran out. The night moves forward without hurry. You are dressed for it now, not just in fabric, but in understanding. And that understanding will matter even more once bodies come together and sleep begins to test every decision made so far. You begin to think about sleep now, not as rest alone, but as a shared strategy, shaped by physics more than preference. On the frontier, bedtime arrangements followed rules colder than social custom. You feel the air settle lower in the room and notice where warmth gathers naturally. That is where bodies end up not out of affection, but efficiency. A widely recognized historical reality is that frontier families often slept together in ways that would feel unusual today. Parents, children, sometimes guests arranged themselves to reduce exposed surface area and conserve heat. Beds were less about privacy and more about survival. Heat pooled where bodies touched. Gaps disappeared. The cold lost access. You imagine climbing onto a sleeping platform raised slightly off the floor. Straw or dried grass cushions beneath you, layered with blankets, hides, quilts. Each layer has a role. Softer materials trap air. Heavier ones block drafts. The order matters. People learned it through cold mornings when rearrangement felt urgent. There is a curious detail preserved in a few winter journals. Some families slept head to foot rather than side by side. This balanced heat distribution and reduced the amount of cold air each person faced. It sounds awkward, but it worked. Efficiency trumped elegance every time. You shift slightly, picturing how that arrangement would feel surprisingly natural after a few nights. Scholars still debate whether these shared sleeping practices reduced illness transmission or increased it during long winters. The records are mixed. What is clear is that cold exposure posed a more immediate threat than contagion in many cases. People prioritized what killed fastest. You notice how people dressed for sleep differently than for waking hours. Layers were fewer but carefully chosen. Too many layers restricted movement and caused sweat. Too few invited chill. Sleep required balance, not abundance. You feel how your own breathing slows when warmth stabilizes muscles, loosening without effort. A lesser-known practice involved placing hot stones or warmed bricks near feet rather than near the core. Warming extremities preserved circulation and reduced the urge to curl too tightly, which could strain joints and restrict breathing. This small adjustment improved rest dramatically. You imagine the gentle heat radiating upward through blankets, subtle and reassuring. One mainstream observation from domestic records is that people rarely slept uninterrupted through winter nights. Waking briefly was normal. Bodies checked conditions. Fires were nudged, covers adjusted. Then sleep returned. This was not considered insomnia. It was vigilance softened by habit. You lie there aware of sounds again. The house settles. Wind presses and releases. Someone shifts nearby, the rustle of fabric barely audible. These noises are comforting. Silence would feel wrong. Frontier sleepers trusted continuity, not quiet. There is a quirky habit mentioned in some letters that feels almost tender. Parents often place children between adults during the coldest nights. This was not indulgence, it was protection. Children lost heat faster, adults served as living insulation. The arrangement felt ordinary, then not sentimental. Some historians continue to examine how sleeping practices varied between regions and cultures. Evidence suggests significant borrowing and adaptation. Indigenous methods of shared warmth influenced settler routines more than official histories admit. Knowledge crossed boundaries quietly when survival was at stake. You notice how fear fades when sleep systems work. People rested because they trusted their setup. That trust mattered. Exhaustion weakened judgment. Rest restored it. Winter punished those who treated sleep lightly. As you breathe slowly, you feel how the imagined weight of blankets grounds you. The smell of wool and smoke blend softly. The fire murmurs low and steady. Nothing requires immediate action. You realize how modern ideas of personal space would have seemed impractical here. Warmth required cooperation. Bodies became tools arranged thoughtfully. This was not hardship in their eyes. It was common sense shaped by environment. The night deepens further. Frost creeps along the window edges. Inside, heat holds. Sleep arrives in layers, drifting rather than crashing. You accept that pattern easily now. You let yourself sink into that rhythm, knowing that shared warmth was not just physical. It reinforced a sense of continuity. Someone else was always there, breathing, shifting, alive. That reassurance softened the cold's edge. As your thoughts slow, you sense how these sleeping arrangements carried families through nights that might otherwise have broken them. Winter remained relentless, but it no longer felt lonely, and that quietly made all the difference. You notice how evening begins to feel purposeful rather than relaxed. On the frontier night, routines were not about winding down in the modern sense. They were about preventing tomorrow's problems from being born. Every small action taken before sleep carried weight. You sense that seriousness now as the light lowers and movements become deliberate. A well-documented reality from household journals is that many winter accidents happened at dawn, not during storms. People woke cold, disorganized and rushed. Fingers fumbled. Fires were slow to revive. Boots froze stiff. Those mornings taught a lesson that reshaped evenings. Preparation at night protected the morning body when it was weakest. You move through the space with that awareness. Tools are checked once more, not used, just confirmed. A knife handle faces outward, where a hand expects it. A hat is placed inside a sleeve, so it stays warm. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. Drama means something was forgotten. There is a quietly clever habit recorded in several family accounts. Some people tied cords between important items at night. Mittens linked together. Boots lightly tethered to a bed leg. In the dark, half awake, those connections prevented loss and confusion. It sounds excessive until you imagine groping with numb fingers in freezing air. Then it makes perfect sense. You realize how memory works differently when cold. The body conserves energy by narrowing focus. Complex searches become expensive. Evening routines simplified the morning by removing choices. Everything had a place because thinking burned heat. Scholars have explored whether these routines developed primarily through communal teaching or individual failure. Some argue that stories of past mistakes guided behavior. Others believe repetition alone shaped habit. Likely both mattered. What stands out is how uniform these routines became across regions with similar climates. You pause near the fire again, watching how it is settled for the night. Coals are banked, ashes drawn forward, just enough to slow oxygen. This is done calmly, without ceremony. A fire left too lively risked burning out before dawn. A fire smothered too much died completely. The balance is subtle, learned through many nights. One mainstream observation from period sources is that families often prepared a small bundle of kindling and set it within arm's reach of the sleeping area. This was not laziness, it was insurance. In the morning, before bodies fully warmed, reaching for distant wood cost precious heat. That small bundle shortened exposure and eased the day's first task. You imagine the quiet order of these preparations. Water containers shifted closer to warmth, so ice formed slowly. Clothing loosened and laid flat to prevent creases that would bite skin later. Damp items placed where they can dry gently, not scorched. The house becomes a map of intention. There is a quirky but effective detail mentioned in a few winter letters. Some families placed a small board or cloth over the door latch at night, not to secure it but to block cold air flowing through the metal. That tiny adjustment reduced frost buildup and kept handles usable by morning. Cold loved metal. People learn to interrupt that relationship. You feel how these habits reduce anxiety. Knowing that morning has been considered allows the mind to rest. Frontier families understood that fear wasted energy. Confidence, even quiet confidence, conserved it. You sit down slowly, letting your body remember where warmth holds longest. The night feels calmer now, not because danger is gone, but because it has been accounted for. This distinction mattered deeply. Winter did not require courage so much as competence. Some historians still examine how these routines differed between households with many children and those without. Evidence suggests that larger families developed stricter systems simply because chaos was costlier. More bodies meant more variables. Order prevented cascading problems. You notice how children participated in these routines without complaint. Tasks were simple, repetitive, and framed as normal. Lay out socks, stack kindling, check the door cloth. These actions taught responsibility without lectures. The lesson was felt, not explained. There is also an emotional rhythm to evenings like this. Voices soften, movements slow, not out of sentiment but conservation. Loud talking burned breath, unnecessary movement burned calories, calm became practical. You lean back and feel how the house responds. Drafts settle, heat steadies, the space feels ready. That readiness is comforting in a way that goes deeper than warmth alone. You think about how modern evenings often do the opposite. We exhaust ourselves before bed, overstimulate rush mornings. Out here, the night absorbs effort so the morning can begin gently. That inversion feels wise. As the last light fades, you sense how nothing has been left to chance. The night will still be cold, the morning will still demand effort, but it will not surprise you. You let that assurance sink into your muscles. Shoulders drop, breathing lengthens. The body understands when conditions are stable. The fire murmurs softly. Someone nearby shifts, then stills. Outside, frost tightens its grip. Inside, preparation has already done its work. You close your eyes, not fully asleep yet, but resting in the knowledge that the small choices made tonight have already protected the hours to come. And that quiet protection, more than any heroic act, is what carried frontier families through winter after winter. Your thoughts drift toward food now, not with hunger exactly, but with awareness. On the frontier, eating in winter was never casual. Meals were chosen with the night in mind, especially the long stretch, when movement stopped and the body had to generate warmth on its own. You feel how the cold waits for stillness, how it creeps closer once activity fades. Food was fuel in the most literal sense. One firmly established pattern found in winter journals is that evening meals mattered more than morning ones during the coldest months. People who went to bed underfed often woke shaking, even when well clothed and sheltered. Fat and density carried warmth through the night. Taste was secondary. Satisfaction was measured in hours, not pleasure. You imagine the table set simply. Stews thick with marrow, bread heavy and dark, salt meat warmed slowly, so grease rendered gently. These foods did not spike energy. They released it steadily. The body understood the difference, even if no one explained it aloud. You feel that knowledge settle as a kind of calm, a quiet trust in what you have taken in. There is a small telling detail scattered through family accounts. Many people ate their heaviest meal just before sleep despite modern instincts to avoid that. Out here, digestion generated heat. A full stomach acted like an internal fire, slow and reliable. You picture someone scraping a bowl clean, not out of greed but calculation. Some researchers continue to discuss whether frontier diets shifted significantly in winter or whether quantities simply increased. Evidence suggests both. Fresh foods disappeared, preserved fats took center stage, Meals simplified but grew more intentional. The cold rewrote menus without asking permission. You notice how cooking methods changed too. Long simmering replaced quick frying. Lids stayed on pots to conserve heat and moisture. Kitchens were not warm gathering spaces. They were work zones kept cool to prevent sweating. The fire for cooking behaved differently from the fire for heating. Each had a role. A lesser-known habit involved timing water intake carefully. Drinking large amounts of cold liquid late at night could drop core temperature. Some families warmed drinks slightly or limited them before sleep. This was not deprivation. It was awareness of how easily the body lost heat through small mistakes. You recall reading that scurvy and malnutrition were not the most immediate winter threats for many frontier families. Cold stress was. Calories mattered first, variety mattered later. That order shaped survival. You feel how pragmatic that is stripped of romance. There is a curious practice mentioned in a few winter letters that feels almost ritualistic. Some households reserved a specific food for the coldest nights. A piece of dried fat, a special broth. It was not superstition, it was morale. Knowing something warming remained untouched until truly needed eased anxiety. That calm preserved energy too. Specialists still debate how much of this food wisdom was shared openly versus guarded within families. In times of scarcity, knowledge could be power, but winter also fostered quiet cooperation. Neighbours exchanged advice, if not always supplies. Hunger sharpened generosity in some places and suspicion in others. You sit and feel the imagined weight of food settling, warmth spreading slowly. The body relaxes when it knows reserves exist. Frontier families understood that hunger felt like cold long before the stomach growled. The two sensations intertwined. You notice how meals were eaten without hurry. Fast eating wasted heat through hurried breathing and movement. Slow chewing warmed food slightly before it reached the stomach. Even posture mattered. People leaned in toward warmth, conserving what they could. There is also the matter of cleanup. Dishes were scraped thoroughly, not only to avoid waste but to prevent moisture buildup that would freeze later. Water was used sparingly and disposed of carefully. Kitchens were left ready for morning, not abandoned in fatigue. Evening effort protected dawn again. One well-accepted observation from settlement records is that families who maintained consistent eating routines suffered fewer nighttime cold emergencies. Predictability stabilized bodies. Irregular meals caused temperature swings that made sleep restless and judgment poor. Winter rewarded rhythm. You imagine children learning these habits without lectures. They were handed smaller bowls but encouraged to finish. They were given fat-first treats later. These patterns shaped bodies quietly, without explanation. There is a faint smell in the room now. Cooked meat, warm grain, smoke. It lingers pleasantly, signaling safety. Scent mattered more than we realize. Familiar smells calmed nerves. Calm nerves conserved warmth. As you lean back, you feel how food anchors the night. Fire warms the air. Shelter blocks the wind. Clothing holds heat close. Food keeps it moving from within. Each system supports the others. None works alone. You think about modern dieting rules and how foreign they would sound here. Eat light at night. Avoid fat. Drink cold water. Out here, those ideas would feel reckless. Context matters. Winter rewrote priorities completely. Your breathing slows. The imagined fullness in your stomach feels grounding. The body prepares for stillness, confident it can generate what it needs. That confidence softens vigilance into rest. Outside, the cold deepens quietly. Inside, warmth circulates steadily. No one speaks, but the shared understanding is clear. The night will be long, it has been planned for. You let that thought settle gently. Food has done its work. The fire holds. The house stands. Sleep approaches not as an escape, but as part of the system that keeps everything balanced. And as your eyes grow heavy, you sense how these simple, deliberate meals carried families through winters that might otherwise have worn them down piece by piece. Nourishment here was not indulgence. It was wisdom made edible, and it continues to warm you even now. You drift toward the kitchen space again, but now you notice how different it feels from the rest of the house. It is cooler here by design. Frontier families learned that cooking warmth and living warmth were not the same thing. Too much heat while preparing food caused sweat, and sweat invited trouble the moment you stepped away. The kitchen existed in a careful balance, warm enough to work, cool enough to stay dry. A broadly recognized pattern in frontier households was the separation of cooking fires from heating fires whenever possible. Even in single-room homes, people adjusted hearth use depending on the task. A low, steady fire warmed the body. A focused, efficient fire cooked food quickly, then stepped back. This distinction reduced wasted fuel and protected the body from overheating. You feel how thoughtful that is as you imagine moving between spaces. You picture a pot set slightly to the side of the flames, not centered. Heat rises unevenly, and people learn to use that. Simmering rather than boiling conserved fuel and moisture. Lids stayed on. Stirring was slow and deliberate. Nothing splashed, nothing steamed unnecessarily. Every movement respected the cold waiting just beyond the walls. There is an oddly charming detail hidden in a few winter accounts. Some families kept a dedicated winter spoon, often wooden and thick-handled. Not because other spoons broke, but because metal stole heat from the hand and chilled fingers quickly. That one spoon lived near the hearth, all season darkened by use, trusted without question. You imagine its worn surface smooth from years of quiet service. Historians still examine how these cooking habits evolved under pressure. Did people arrive with such restraint, or did winter force it upon them? Evidence suggests adaptation happened fast. Those who cooked the same way year-round paid for it in fuel loss and fatigue. Winter sharpened efficiency. You notice how meals were planned to reduce kitchen exposure. Ingredients were prepped earlier in the day, when light was better and bodies warmer. Evening cooking focused on assembly, not creation. This shortened time spent standing still in cooler air. You feel how this would matter when joints stiffened easily. There is a lesser-known but clever technique mentioned in a few family stories. Some cooks warmed bowls and plates near the fire before serving, not for luxury, but to prevent food from cooling too quickly. Cold food cooled the body. Warm vessels preserved heat longer. The difference between these approaches could be felt within minutes. One established observation from domestic records is that kitchens rarely became social spaces in winter. Conversation happened elsewhere. Cooking was quiet, focused, efficient. Talking wasted breath. Movement wasted heat. The work was done with minimal distraction. You sense the calm discipline in that. Scholars continue to debate how much of this kitchen wisdom was shared openly between households. Some argue that women passed techniques informally during visits. Others believe families guarded their methods closely, especially in harsher climates. Likely both occurred. Knowledge flowed where trust existed. You imagine the smell of food thickening the air, not overpowering but grounding. Familiar scents told the body warmth was coming. That anticipation itself was comforting. The nervous system relaxed slightly, conserving energy. There is a curious practice recorded in a few northern settlements. During the coldest spells, some families deliberately cooked foods that required chewing rather than swallowing quickly. Chewing generated warmth in the jaw and slowed eating, extending heat production. It sounds almost comical, but people noticed the difference. You notice how water was handled carefully. Snow was melted slowly, not dumped into hot pots all at once. Sudden cooling cracked vessels and stole heat from rooms. Melted water was kept just warm enough to prevent freezing, not hot enough to steam. Steam carried heat away quickly. Winter punished impatience even here. A widely accepted detail from period letters is that spills were treated seriously. Water on floors froze, creating hazards and chilling the room. Cloths were kept ready. Mess was not tolerated, not from strictness, but necessity. Cleanliness preserved warmth. You lean against the imagined counter and feel how the kitchen teaches restraint. Nothing here is decorative. Everything earns its place by function. The cold simplifies priorities ruthlessly. There is also the matter of leftovers. Food was stored in ways that prevented freezing solid. Pots were tucked into insulated corners, covered with cloth, positioned near warmth, but not over it. Frozen food wasted fuel to revive and often lost texture and nutrition. People learned to manage temperature even after cooking ended. Some researchers point out that these habits resemble modern energy-efficient cooking principles. The difference is that frontier families learned them through direct consequence, rather than theory. Mistakes were immediate and memorable. You notice how children were often kept out of the kitchen during winter cooking, not because of danger alone, but because small bodies lost heat faster standing still. They were sent to warmer areas, given tasks that kept them moving. This protected them without explanation. As evening deepens, the kitchen quiets, the fire reduces, pots are moved aside, nothing is left unattended. The space transitions from work to readiness. Morning has already been considered. You feel how all of this supports rest later. Efficient cooking means less fatigue. Less fatigue means better judgment. Better judgment means fewer cold mistakes. Winter survival emerges as a chain of small successes rather than heroic acts. The smell of food lingers faintly as you move back toward warmth. It wraps around you like reassurance. The body knows it has been cared for thoughtfully. Outside, the cold remains patient. Inside, the kitchen has done its part and stepped aside. You sense how this quiet competence runs through the household, linking fire, food, clothing, and shelter into one system. Your breathing slows again. The night feels manageable, not because it is gentle, but because nothing has been wasted. Winter respects efficiency. As you settle, you realize how much wisdom lived in these cold kitchens. Not written, not announced, but practiced nightly. And as that understanding settles into you, the space around you feels calmer, steadier, ready to carry you forward into the deeper rhythms of winter life. Your attention drifts toward the children now, not because they are loud or restless, but because they are quietly absorbing everything. On the frontier, winter education began early, long before anyone explained why it mattered. Children learned cold the way they learned language, by immersion, by repetition, by watching what adults did without comment. You see small hands moving with purpose, mimicking motions that once felt mysterious. A widely observed truth in frontier households is that children were expected to participate in winter routines as soon as they could walk steadily. This was not harshness, it was practicality. Small tasks taught awareness. Carrying kindling, laying out socks, checking door cloths. These actions built familiarity with cold management before fear ever entered the picture. Winter became normal, not dramatic. You notice how children move constantly. They are rarely still for long. Adults understood intuitively that stillness chilled small bodies faster. Tasks were framed as errands, games, responsibilities, anything that kept blood moving. A child sent to fetch something across the room was not being inconvenienced. They were being warmed. There is a curious detail mentioned in several family recollections. Some parents deliberately gave children winter chores that required bare hands briefly, then taught them to rewarm properly. Hands near the fire, but not touching. Fingers flexed slowly. This taught sensation awareness. Children learned the difference between cold discomfort and dangerous numbness early. It was a lesson learned gently, not through panic. Scholars continue to explore how frontier childhood differed emotionally from modern expectations. Some argue that early exposure to hardship fostered resilience. Others suggest it normalized risk. The truth likely sits somewhere between. What stands out is how children were rarely shielded from winter realities. They were guided through them. You see how clothing for children was adjusted constantly. Layers added and removed without ceremony. Sleeves rolled, caps tied tighter. Adults watched skin color movement, speed attention. These cues mattered more than complaints. A quiet child in winter raised concern. Noise meant circulation. One mainstream observation from settlement diaries is that children often slept deeper than adults, despite cold conditions. Their bodies adapted quickly when routines were stable. Adults trusted this, but they never stopped checking. A hand placed briefly on a child's back. A blanket pulled higher. Care was constant but unobtrusive. There is a quirky habit described in a few letters that feels almost playful. Some parents marked winter growth by how clothing fit at the end of the season, not to measure height alone but endurance. A child who outgrew a coat had also survived another winter. The garment became a quiet record of resilience. You realize how storytelling played a role too. Winter tales were told not to frighten, but to instruct. Stories of people who forgot to change socks, who rushed mornings, who ignored wind. These narratives taught consequence without lecturing. Children learned patterns through imagination before facing them personally. Researchers still debate how much of this winter knowledge was consciously taught versus unconsciously absorbed. Evidence suggests that children learned most by watching, not listening. Adults rarely explained why something was done. They simply did it the same way every time. Consistency was the teacher. You notice how children were often paired with adults during tasks, not to supervise closely, but to share warmth and rhythm. Walking together conserved heat. Working side by side normalized effort. Winter became communal, not isolating. There is also the matter of play. Snow was not avoided entirely. It was managed. Children played in short bursts, then returned to warmth. Wet clothing was changed immediately. Play taught boundaries. The cold was fun until it wasn't. That line became instinctive. A less discussed but important practice involved teaching children to recognize early signs of cold stress. Tingling fingers, stiff cheeks, clumsy movements. These were pointed out gently, then corrected. Children learned to self-monitor long before they had words for it. You imagine a child sitting near the fire, cheeks flushed, boots drying slowly. No scolding, no fear, just routine correction. That calm response prevented panic later. Winter punished panic harshly. One accepted reality from frontier records is that children who grew up with consistent winter routines often carried those habits into adulthood, even after moving to milder climates. They dressed differently. They paced themselves. They noticed wind. Early lessons lingered long after the environment changed. You also notice how responsibility built confidence. Children trusted themselves because they were trusted. They knew where things belonged. They knew what to do when cold deepened. That knowledge reduced fear, which reduced mistakes. Some scholars continue to question whether modern childhood would benefit from similar exposure to environmental awareness. The debate remains unsettled. What is clear is that frontier children were not fragile. They were prepared. You feel a quiet admiration for how gently this preparation happened. No speeches, no drills, just repetition. Winter shaped habits the way water shapes stone, slowly without force. As the night deepens, children settle where warmth is strongest. They lean into adults without thinking. Their breathing slows. The house adjusts around them. They trust the systems in place because they have always worked. You realize how much of frontier survival depended on this transfer of knowledge. Skills not written down, not formalized, simply lived and passed on through example. Children were the future carriers of that wisdom. Outside, the cold presses steadily. Inside, small bodies rest protected by layers of intention and care. Winter is not feared here, it is understood. You let that image soften your thoughts. The quiet competence of these children, shaped not by comfort, but by awareness, feels grounding. Their lessons echo forward, reminding you that wisdom often arrives early if the environment demands it. Your breathing slows further. The house holds steady. The night continues. And somewhere in that rhythm, you sense how the future of frontier winter survival rested not in strength alone, but in teaching the next generation how to listen, adjust, and endure calmly. Your attention shifts inward now, toward the body itself, because winter had a way of revealing truths that warmer seasons concealed. Illness behaved differently when cold pressed close. Frontier families learned to distinguish between sickness and cold stress with careful observation rather than instruments. You lie still and listen, the way they did, noticing. Breath sensation balanced small deviations from normal. A well-established reality from winter medical notes is that many conditions mistaken for disease were actually responses to cold exposure, dehydration, or exhaustion. Shivering was not always fever. Lethargy was not always infection. Cold blurred symptoms. Misreading them led to poor decisions. Experience taught families to pause and assess before reacting. You imagine waking in the night with a sense that something feels off. Not pain, not fear, just imbalance. The response is not panic. Panic burns energy. Instead, people checked simple things. Are hands warming when held near the body? Is breathing steady? Is awareness clear? These cues mattered more than speculation. There is a quietly practical habit mentioned in several household accounts. Some families kept a short list of winter questions in mind, never written, always remembered. Are you sweating? Are you shivering uncontrollably? Are you confused? Each answer guided the next action. This mental checklist prevented overreaction and delay alike. Scholars continue to examine how frontier health knowledge compared to formal medical advice of the time. In many cases, domestic practice proved more effective in winter conditions than textbook remedies. Doctors were scarce, families became their own diagnosticians out of necessity. You notice how fever and cold demanded opposite responses, yet felt similar at first. Fever required cooling and hydration. Cold stress required insulation and fuel. Mixing these treatments worsened outcomes. That distinction was learned through observation rather than theory. The body taught its caretakers what worked. One mainstream observation from settlement records is that people survived illnesses more reliably in winter when they maintained routine rather than resting excessively. Gentle movement preserved circulation. Complete stillness often worsened cold-related symptoms. Rest was balanced, not absolute. There is a lesser-known detail that feels almost counterintuitive. Some families avoided heavy blankets during certain illnesses, fearing sweat accumulation. Instead, they used layered coverings that could be adjusted quickly. Moisture management mattered even more when the body was compromised. You imagine someone sitting up briefly adjusting covers, then settling again. No drama, no alarm, just constant calibration. Winter punished neglect more than effort. Researchers still debate how much of this winter health wisdom originated from indigenous practices versus European folk medicine. Evidence suggests significant overlap and exchange. Cold made practical thinkers out of everyone, regardless of origin. You also notice how smell played a role. Breath that smelled sweet or sour raised concern. Sweat odor indicated overheating. These sensory cues guided care long before numbers existed. The body spoke, people listened. There is a quirky habit mentioned in a few letters that feels almost intimate. Some caregivers warmed their hands before touching someone ill, believing cold hands shocked the body and worsened discomfort. Whether scientifically sound or not, the practice improved comfort and trust. Calm aided recovery. One accepted pattern from frontier diaries is that families treated winter illness as a communal responsibility. Someone stayed awake. Fires were tended. Food prepared carefully. Illness was not isolated. Isolation chilled more than it healed. You feel how fear was managed deliberately. Talking softly, moving slowly, keeping light low. Stress raised heart rate and burned warmth. Caregivers protected not just bodies but atmosphere. Some scholars continue to question whether mortality rates were influenced more by environment or by knowledge. Likely both intertwined. Those who understood winter reduced its opportunities to worsen illness. You imagine the quiet of a winter night broken only by breathing and fire sound. Someone stirs. A hand adjusts a blanket. These small actions carried weight. They turned vulnerability into survivability. You realize how modern medicine often separates illness from environment. Out here, they were inseparable. Cold amplified weakness, warmth supported healing. The boundary between health and exposure blurred. As you breathe slowly, you feel gratitude for how attentive these families were. Not heroic, not dramatic, just present. Winter demanded presence. Outside, frost thickens. Inside, care continues steadily. No one expects quick recovery. Time is allowed. Patience is part of treatment. You let that image soften you. Illness does not feel frightening here. It feels managed, observed, contained within routine. That routine creates safety even when bodies falter. Your thoughts slow. The night deepens. The body rests more easily, knowing it would be noticed if something shifted. That reassurance alone preserved strength. Winter remains indifferent, but it is no longer mysterious. It has been studied through countless small moments like these. And as you settle into that understanding, you feel how knowledge, more than medicine, carried frontier families through the coldest nights. You start paying closer attention to the animals, now not because they demand it, but because they quietly offer information no instrument could. On the frontier, animals were not background scenery. They were living sensors constantly responding to shifts in weather pressure and danger. You notice how much calmer you feel when you let them do some of the watching for you. A well-recognized reality from frontier records is that families relied heavily on livestock behavior to gauge winter conditions. Horses, cattle, dogs, even chickens reacted to cold before people fully registered it. A horse turning its hindquarters to the wind, a dog choosing a new sleeping spot closer to shelter, chickens roosting earlier than usual. These signs guided decisions about travel, fire management, and shelter adjustments. You imagine standing quietly near the door, watching a horse outside. It is not restless. Its breathing is steady. One hind leg rests weight shifted comfortably. That posture tells you more than any glance at the sky. Calm animals suggest stable conditions. Sudden alertness means change is coming. Frontier families trusted this without hesitation. There is a curious detail mentioned in several winter journals. Some settlers claimed they could tell how severe a night would be by how tightly dogs curled when they slept. A loose sprawl meant mild cold. A tight coil nose tucked deep suggested sharper temperatures ahead. It sounds like folklore, but enough people noted it to make you pause. Animals conserve heat instinctively. Their choices carried meaning. Researchers still discuss whether this animal-based awareness was learned behavior or something people instinctively trusted. Likely both. Animals had no reason to exaggerate. Their responses were immediate and honest. Humans learned to read that honesty. You notice how animals were positioned deliberately at night. Livestock sheltered from wind, but not overheated. Too much warmth made animals sweat, which led to sickness. Balance mattered here too. People adjusted bedding windbreaks and spacing carefully. Animals were valuable, but more importantly, they were indicators. A sick animal often signaled a problem in shelter or feed long before people felt it themselves. One widely accepted observation from settlement accounts is that families who paid attention to animal health suffered fewer winter losses overall. Animals mirrored environmental stress. Ignoring those signs meant missing early warnings. There is a lesser-known but clever practice recorded in a few northern regions. Some families placed water containers near animals rather than near themselves. If water froze unusually fast near livestock, it indicated drafts or exposure that needed correction. This helped protect both animals and people. You imagine someone checking a trough at dawn, learning more from ice thickness than from the thermometer they did not own. You feel how animals shaped daily rhythm. Feeding times shifted with daylight. Evening feed was heavier in winter, helping animals generate warmth through digestion. That mirrored human practice. Warmth came from within as much as without. The parallel is striking. Scholars continue to debate how much of this animal-centered knowledge came from indigenous practices versus European pastoral traditions. Evidence suggests a blending. Indigenous groups often read animal behavior with extraordinary precision, and settlers learned quickly when they paid attention. Credit was rarely recorded, but the knowledge spread anyway. You notice how dogs occupied a special role. They slept near doors, near children, near drafts. They alerted to unfamiliar sounds, but more subtly, they reflected the night's stability. A relaxed dog meant conditions were holding. A restless one meant vigilance was needed. Dogs extended human awareness effortlessly. There is an oddly tender detail tucked into some family stories. During extreme cold, people sometimes allowed animals closer to living spaces than usual. Not inside necessarily, but nearer. The shared warmth reduced losses on both sides. This was not sentimentality, it was efficiency. One mainstream observation from winter correspondence is that animals often survived conditions that challenged people, provided they were fed and sheltered appropriately. Their endurance reassured families. If the animals were coping, people felt they could too. You listen again. Outside there is movement but not alarm. A horse shifts. Snow crunches softly. A dog sighs and settles. These sounds form a background rhythm more reliable than silence. Silence could mean snow muffling the world, or something moving carefully. Animals help distinguish between the two. There is a quirky but telling habit mentioned in a few letters. Some families named specific winter behaviours, not animals. The wind watcher, the early sleeper, the restless one. This language reflected how closely people observed patterns rather than individuals. Behaviour mattered more than personality. You feel how this attention to animals reduced loneliness. Winter nights could feel vast and empty. The presence of breathing creatures nearby grounded people in the living world. Warmth was not just physical, it was relational. Some historians still examine whether reliance on animals made frontier families safer or simply more attentive. The distinction hardly matters. Attention itself was the protection. Animals gave people something to watch besides their own fear. You imagine stepping outside briefly, feeling the cold bite your cheeks, then listening. Animals respond first. You read their calm and return inside reassured. No extra fuel burned, no unnecessary movement. Winter is still demanding, but it has not escalated. As the night deepens, animals settle into their own routines. People mirror them. Movement slows, breathing deepens. Everyone conserves energy. You realize how modern life has removed many of these cues. We rely on forecasts and alerts. Out here, awareness was embodied, shared across species, quietly reliable. You let that thought settle. The animals nearby breathe steadily. Their presence anchors the night. You are not alone with the cold. You are part of a small system all responding to the same conditions. Your thoughts soften. The house creaks gently. Outside, the animals remain calm. Inside, warmth holds. Winter has been acknowledged, monitored, and accepted. You close your eyes with that reassurance. If something changes, the animals will notice first. Until then, the night is simply cold, not dangerous. And that distinction allows rest to come easily, carried on the steady rhythm of shared breath and quiet awareness. You notice how silence behaves differently now. It is not the peaceful quiet people imagine when they think of snow-covered landscapes. It feels alert, almost watchful. Frontier families learned early that silence could be misleading. Noise announced itself, honestly. Silence required interpretation. You lie still and listen, letting the quiet speak without trusting it too much. A firmly grounded observation from winter travel journals is that experienced settlers paid closer attention when expected sounds disappeared. Wind usually whispered through grass or branches. Animals shifted. Fire breathed. When those layers dropped away, without explanation, people became cautious. Silence could mean snow absorbing sound, or it could mean something moving carefully. The difference mattered. You hold your breath for a moment and listen again. The fire murmurs faintly. That is good. Animals breathe nearby. Also good. The absence of sudden noises does not reassure you by itself. It is the presence of familiar, steady ones that does. Frontier sleepers trusted continuity more than stillness. There is a curious anecdote preserved in several family recollections. Some people claimed they could sense danger by the quality of silence, not its presence. A thick quiet felt different from a thin one. Snow muffled the world gently. Predators or strangers created a silence that felt tense, directional. This sounds mystical until you remember how attuned the human nervous system can become when it must be. Researchers have long discussed whether this sensitivity developed through repeated exposure or whether it reflected an older shared instinct sharpened by necessity. The sources do not agree. What is clear is that people learned to pause when silence felt wrong, even if they could not explain why. You notice how bodies respond to quiet. Muscles tighten slightly, breathing slows, awareness stretches outward. Frontier families trained themselves not to react immediately. Sudden movement wasted heat and revealed position. Stillness bought time to listen more accurately. One well-established pattern from winter diaries is that people often identified approaching animals or people while barely opening their eyes. Sound travelled differently at night, especially over snow. A branch snapping carried farther. A slow creak meant wait. Wind, through different textures, told its own story. These cues were not named. They were registered and sorted subconsciously. There is a lesser-known but telling habit mentioned in a few letters. Some sleepers oriented themselves deliberately so their ears faced the most open direction. Not for comfort, but for information. Hearing was valued over sight in darkness. You imagine turning slightly, positioning your body to receive sound more clearly. Scholars still debate how much of this listening skill was unique to frontier life versus a general human ability dulled by modern environments. The argument remains unresolved. What feels certain is that quiet attention kept people alive more often than sharp eyesight ever did. You realize how modern silence feels different. It is often artificial, created by insulation and distance. Out here, silence is never empty. It is filled with potential meaning. That awareness makes it feel heavier, but also more informative. You listen again. The wind brushes the walls lightly, then moves on. That tells you something important. It is not probing for gaps aggressively. Conditions are holding. You let a fraction of tension release. There is an oddly practical detail recorded in some winter camps. People sometimes left a small object hanging near the entrance, a spoon or strip of leather. Not as an alarm exactly, but as a sound reference. If it moved without wind, attention sharpened. If it stayed still while wind blew, snow was building. Simple, effective quiet. One commonly accepted observation from settlement accounts is that people slept in lighter phases during winter nights. Deep, unbroken sleep was rare. Instead, sleep came in waves. Brief awakenings allowed reassessment. This pattern was not considered a problem. It was adaptive. Listening happened between dreams. You feel that pattern beginning now? Your mind drifts, then surfaces, briefly checking sounds, temperature, body sensation. Everything is steady. You let yourself sink again. These gentle check-ins feel reassuring rather than disruptive. There is also the matter of human noise. People learn to minimize unnecessary sounds at night. Dropping objects, startled animals. Loud voices carried farther than expected. Quiet preserved normalcy. Calmness reduced escalation. Winter rewarded discretion. Some historians continue to explore whether fear of attack shaped this listening culture as much as fear of weather. The records suggest both influenced behavior. Remote settlements faced risks from animals and people alike. Silence was information in all cases. You notice how the house itself participates in listening. Wood contracts and settles. Each sound has a familiar place in the pattern. An unfamiliar noise stands out immediately. Frontier families knew their shelters so well that deviation caught attention instantly. There is a quirky story passed down in a few families about someone waking because the house sounded wrong. Not louder, not quieter, just wrong. A snow load had shifted, a support beam had cracked. Attention to sound prevented collapse. It is a reminder that listening protected more than bodies. You relax slightly, trusting the familiar rhythm again. Fire, breath, distant animal movement. These sounds anchor you. Silence frames them without erasing them. The night feels legible now. You realize how this listening skill also softened loneliness. Being able to hear the world respond reduced the sense of isolation. Silence did not mean emptiness. It meant space filled with subtle signals. Outside, snow begins to fall softly. You do not hear individual flakes. You hear their effect. Wind loses its edge. Sounds dull. The silence thickens in a way that feels safe. You recognize the difference now. You adjust your position minutely, not to seek comfort alone, but to improve awareness. This movement costs little and buys reassurance. Frontier sleepers perfected this balance. As your breathing slows, you let the sounds blur gently. Listening remains, but effort fades. The body knows it would wake if something changed. That trust allows rest. You drift again, not fully asleep, not fully awake. The quiet holds you without demanding attention. Winter has been acknowledged, interpreted, and accepted for now. In this space between listening and dreaming, you sense how much survival depended on restraint, not reacting to every silence, not ignoring meaningful ones. Knowing the difference came from long familiarity. Your thoughts soften. The house breathes. Snow continues its work outside, muffling, insulating, reshaping the night. Inside, awareness settles into calm vigilance. You allow yourself to rest within that balance. Silence no longer feels threatening. It feels informative, textured, alive. And with that understanding, sleep moves closer, carried gently on the quiet frontier skill of knowing when nothing is truly happening. You begin to think about the wind itself, now not as background weather, but as something with intention. Frontier families treated wind like an opponent that learned, adapted, and exploited weakness. Snow could pile, cold could settle, wind searched, it tested edges, seams, and choices. You feel it outside now, sliding along the walls, probing gently, waiting for mistakes. A clearly established reality from winter travel accounts is that wind exposure, more than low temperature, alone determined survival outcomes. People endured extreme cold when wind was managed. Far milder temperatures became deadly when exposure remained constant. This understanding shaped every decision about camp placement, house orientation, and travel timing. You notice how the house does not face the open ground directly. It turns slightly away, shoulders angled against the prevailing push. You step mentally outside and feel how wind behaves differently across terrain. It accelerates downhill. It curls around trees. It presses harder in open spaces and loses interest where resistance confuses it. Frontier families learn to read this behavior by watching snow drift patterns and listening to how sound carried. They chose shelter where wind brushed past instead of through. That distinction meant warmth. There is a curious and surprisingly precise practice mentioned in several winter journals. Some travelers tossed handfuls of dry grass or ash into the air at dusk, watching how it fell. The way it spiraled or flattened revealed airflow, invisible to the eye. This guided where they stopped for the night. It looked simple. It saved lives. Researchers continue to discuss whether this wind-reading skill was consciously taught or instinctively developed through exposure. The records suggest people rarely explained it. They demonstrated it. Others learned by copying. The land corrected errors quickly. You notice how wind shaped movement. People avoided ridgelines at night, even when travel seemed easier there. Wind scoured those paths relentlessly. Valleys offered protection, but also trapped cold. The best spots balanced both. That balance was learned through trial and memory, not maps. One mainstream observation from frontier letters is that shelters placed just below crests performed better than those at bottoms or tops. Wind flowed overhead rather than directly across. Snow accumulated predictably instead of scouring walls. You imagine standing in such a place, feeling the wind pass above you almost politely. There is a quirky detail tucked into some family stories. Children were taught to notice how smoke behaved long before they understood why. Smoke hugging the ground warned of pressure changes and impending wind shifts. Straight rising smoke meant calmer conditions. These lessons arrived through observation, not explanation. You feel how wind also shaped sound. A steady push flattened noise, gusting created rhythm. Experienced listeners could tell if wind was strengthening or settling without stepping outside. That information guided whether fires were banked heavier or lighter. Small adjustments followed big consequences. Scholars still debate how much wind awareness differentiated experienced travelers from newcomers. Evidence suggests it was one of the clearest dividing lines. Those who ignored wind focused only on cold and snow. Those who read wind survived more reliably. You imagine a family choosing where to stop after a long day, not where the ground looks smooth, not where the view is best, but where wind loses interest. A stand of trees, a rock outcrop, a shallow hollow angled just right. Shelter begins before walls are built. There is an understated practice mentioned in some winter camp notes. People sometimes repositioned shelters after the first night. If wind behavior changed, the site was wrong. Pride did not override physics. Moving cost energy, staying cost more. You notice how wind dictated posture, even indoors. People sat with backs to likely drafts. Sleeping arrangements accounted for airflow. Even conversations shifted position unconsciously. Bodies aligned with warmth and resistance. One well-supported observation from historical records is that wind exposure often caused frostbite faster than still air cold even when temperatures were higher. This led to conservative travel choices. People waited. Waiting was not weakness, it was calculation. You feel how modern forecasts describe wind in abstract numbers. Out here, wind was personal. It touched skin. It whispered along walls. It made its intentions known to those who paid attention. There is a curious anecdote in a trader's journal describing wind as having moods: calm curiosity, aggressive searching, bored retreat. While poetic, it reflects pattern recognition. Wind behaved differently under different conditions. Naming those patterns helped people remember them. Some historians continue to examine how indigenous wind reading influenced settler survival strategies. Evidence suggests significant borrowing. Indigenous groups understood wind as part of the land's language. Settlers who listened learned faster. Those who dismissed it paid for that arrogance. You sit still and listen now. Wind brushes the shelter, then slides away. It does not linger. That tells you the choices made earlier were sound. Relief arrives quietly, without celebration. As snow begins to fall more steadily, wind loses some power. Snow absorbs energy, smooths airflow, blunts edges. You recognize this shift immediately. The night feels heavier, safer. You adjust slightly, aligning yourself where drafts are weakest. This movement feels natural now, not conscious. The body has learned. You realize how much confidence came from understanding wind, not control, understanding. Wind could not be stopped, but it could be redirected, confused, avoided. That knowledge transformed fear into strategy. Your breathing deepens, the house holds, wind passes without intrusion. Winter has revealed another layer of its rules. You let that awareness fade gently into rest. Wind remains outside, searching elsewhere. Inside, warmth stays pooled, protected by choices made with attention rather than haste. As sleep draws nearer, you carry one quiet certainty with you. Cold is not random. Wind is not chaotic. They follow patterns. Those who learned them slept better, moved wiser, and lived longer. And now, lying still, you feel the wind move on, unable to settle. That small victory is enough to let the night continue peacefully, carrying you deeper into the steady, deliberate rhythm of frontier winter survival. You start to notice how snow changes character once it stops being new. Earlier in the season, every flake felt like an event. Now snow arrives quietly, layering itself with purpose. Frontier families learn to watch this transition carefully. Snow was not just an obstacle. In the right conditions, it became an ally. A well-established observation from Winterfield notes is that accumulated snow often made camps and homes warmer, not colder. Snow trapped air. Trapped air slowed heat loss. Shelters that survived heavy snowfall without collapse frequently felt more stable afterward. This outcome confused outsiders, but experienced families expected it. Snow softened the wind and sealed gaps the cold air would otherwise exploit. You feel the difference in sound first. The night grows thicker. Sharp edges fade. Wind loses its bite and becomes a dull pressure instead of a searching force. That change is comforting. Snow has weight, and weight brings stillness. You breathe and notice the air feels less hollow now, as if the world has padded itself. There is a curious detail recorded in several mountain expedition journals. Travelers reported waking warmer after snowstorms than before them, provided their shelters held. Snow piled against walls created a natural insulation layer. What looks dangerous from the outside often improved conditions inside. That lesson required trust in structure and patience in response. Researchers continue to examine whether this understanding came from deliberate experimentation or gradual realization. Evidence suggests people noticed the effect repeatedly and adjusted behavior accordingly. Snow was no longer something to fight immediately. It was something to evaluate. You imagine stepping outside briefly and feeling how the air behaves differently against your face. It no longer cuts sharply. It presses gently. That tells you the snowpack is doing its work. Wind is being broken apart before it reaches you. The land itself is participating in your shelter. There is a quirky winter habit mentioned in a few household letters. Some families delayed clearing snow from around their homes during the coldest periods, removing only what threatened roofs or entrances. Leaving snow piled against walls improved warmth. This went against instinct, but experience confirmed it. Cleanliness lost to comfort. One widely accepted detail from frontier architecture is that some homes were deliberately designed to catch drifting snow rather than deflect it. Low walls, angled roofs, strategic placement near natural barriers. These designs looked crude, but they performed beautifully once snow arrived. You notice how snow changes movement too. Sound carries less, visibility softens, the world feels closer, smaller. That reduction in sensory input calms the nervous system. Frontier families noticed this effect, even if they never named it. Snow brought a strange peace. Scholars still debate whether this psychological calming effect influenced survival outcomes. Did people rest better after snowfall? Did calmer minds make fewer mistakes? The records hint at both. Storms were feared during travel, but welcomed once shelter was secure. You feel how snow also stabilized temperature swings. Clear nights without snow often brought brutal cold. Cloud cover and snowfall moderated extremes. The cold remained, but it was less volatile. Predictability mattered more than absolute warmth. There is a lesser-known practice described in a few northern settlements. People sometimes packed snow deliberately around certain structures, shaping drifts into protective berms. This was done carefully, ensuring no moisture penetrated walls. When done right, it improved insulation significantly. Snow became building material. You notice how animals respond as well. Livestock settle more calmly after snowfall. Wind no longer irritates them. They conserve energy better. Their calm feeds back into human confidence. The system steadies. One mainstream observation from winter correspondence is that people often slept deeper after snowstorms, despite colder ambient temperatures. The muffled environment reduced stimulation. Fires behaved more predictably. Drafts eased. Sleep came easier. You lie still and feel that effect now. The night feels padded. Sounds arrive softened. The world presses inward gently, rather than pulling heat away. Snow is working for you. There is a curious anecdote from a trapper's journal describing snow as a blanket. The land pulls over itself. Poetic perhaps, but accurate. Snow covered exposed ground, reducing radiant heat loss. Bare earth bled warmth. Snow sealed it. Some historians continue to question how quickly settlers learned to trust snow this way. Early accounts show panic, frantic clearing, constant fighting against accumulation. Later accounts show restraint. Experience replaced instinct. You imagine the satisfaction of waking after a heavy snowfall and feeling warmer, not colder. That reversal changed attitudes permanently. Snow became something to manage, not eliminate. You also notice how snow influenced timing. Travel paused. Work shifted indoors. People conserved energy. Snow enforced patience. Those who accepted, that rested. Those who resisted, exhausted themselves. You feel how the house responds now. Walls sound quieter. Fire holds steady. Drafts fade. The space feels cocooned. Winter has added a layer rather than stripped one away. There is an understated lesson here. Not every hardship needs immediate removal. Some become protective if allowed to settle. Snow taught frontier families when to intervene and when to wait. Your breathing slows further. The night feels less exposed. You trust the shelter more now, not because it is strong alone, but because the environment has changed in your favor. Outside, snow continues its quiet work, filling gaps, softening edges, reshaping the land. Inside, warmth pools and stays put. Nothing demands action. You let yourself sink into that stillness, understanding that snow once feared has become part of the system that keeps you safe. That realization carries a deep calm. As sleep approaches, you sense how winter reveals its contradictions, slowly. What looks threatening may shelter you. What feels harsh may reduce risk. Wisdom lives in noticing these reversals. You rest with that knowledge, letting the snow do its quiet work. The world feels smaller, closer wrapped. and within that rapt silence you drift gently onward, carried by the strange comfort that only a settled winter night can offer. You begin to understand how winter reshaped the idea of movement itself. On the frontier, travel was not a symbol of progress when cold deepened. It became a question of timing, restraint, and humility. You feel that instinct now, the sense that staying put can be wiser than pushing forward. Winter taught people to slow down, not as surrender, but as strategy. A firmly grounded observation from migration and trading records is that many winter deaths occurred during attempts to keep schedules rather than abandon them. People pressed on because they felt they should not, because conditions allowed it. Those who survived longest often delayed travel, even when supplies ran low, trusting patience over momentum. Waiting conserved energy, movement spent it quickly. You imagine standing at the edge of a trail buried under drifted snow. It looks passable at first glance. The sky is clear, the cold feels manageable. And yet experienced travelers hesitated. They noticed how wind scoured exposed sections, how snow crust broke unpredictably, how daylight shortened faster than expected. These details mattered more than distance. There is a quietly revealing habit mentioned in several winter journals. Some travelers deliberately walked short distances away from camp before committing to a journey. They tested footing, wind exposure, and clothing response. If conditions felt wrong in the first few minutes, they turned back without shame. That early retreat saved lives. Researchers continue to debate whether frontier culture romanticized perseverance too strongly, encouraging dangerous travel. Some accounts praise endurance, others quietly document restraint. Over time, restraint appears to have been the more reliable teacher. Survival rewarded those who listened to conditions rather than ideals. You notice how winter travel altered posture and pace. Steps shortened, breathing slowed, loads lightened. People avoided sweating at all costs. Sweat meant stopping later to dry, which meant exposure. The goal was not speed, it was consistency. One widely accepted detail from period correspondence is that winter journeys often began later in the morning than summer ones. People waited for light and slight warming. Moving too early risked frost injury. This delay felt counterintuitive to those accustomed to early starts, but it worked. There is a quirky detail tucked into some trader accounts. Travelers sometimes counted steps between rest pauses, not distance. After a certain number of steps, they stopped briefly, checked sensation, adjusted layers. This rhythm prevented overexertion. Movement became measured, almost meditative. You feel how modern life equates stopping with failure. Out here, stopping was maintenance. It preserved judgment. Fatigue dulled awareness faster than cold alone. Rest restored it. Scholars still examine how winter slowed economic activity across frontier regions. Trade paused, mail delayed, expectations shifted. Communities adapted to cycles rather than deadlines. Winter enforced realism. You imagine a group deciding not to travel despite clear weather. Supplies are counted again, rations adjusted, fuel conserved, no one complains. The decision feels heavy but correct. Winter punished regret more than caution. There is a lesser-known practice mentioned in a few family letters. Some people marked winter routes mentally with safe stopping points rather than destinations. A stand of trees, a bend in a river, a sheltered hollow. The journey was planned as a series of pauses, not a single push. This changed how people experienced distance. You notice how winter travel favored familiarity. Known paths were safer than shortcuts. Familiar landmarks provided orientation when snow erased trails. People who strayed from known ground risked disorientation even close to home. Snow flattened difference. Knowledge restored it. One mainstream observation from frontier narratives is that winter travelers often carried fewer tools, but knew them better. Excess weight increased fatigue. Familiar tools reduced fumbling. Simplicity preserved warmth. You feel how patience altered fear. When movement was optional, anxiety eased. When movement felt forced, stress rose. Stress burned calories. Calm conserved them. Winter rewarded emotional regulation as much as physical skill. There is an understated lesson in how travel stories were told. Survivors rarely described heroics. They described waiting, turning back, staying one more day. These decisions were framed plainly, without pride. The absence of drama speaks volumes. Some historians continue to debate whether frontier myths later exaggerated winter endurance, overshadowing the quieter wisdom of restraint. The record suggests that later retellings favoured action. Original accounts favoured caution. You imagine standing by a packed trail again, choosing not to go. The relief feels physical. Muscles relax. Breathing steadies. The night feels manageable again. That sensation was familiar to those who survived multiple winters. You notice how children absorbed this lesson too. They learned that some days were travel days and some were not. They learned to accept delay without protest. Winter taught patience early. As the night deepens, movement becomes unnecessary. Everything you need is within reach. Staying put feels not only safe, but efficient. You realize how radically winter reshaped values. Progress slowed. Presence mattered more. The idea of success shifted from arrival to endurance. Your breathing slows again. The house feels steady. Outside, snow continues to settle. There is nowhere you need to be right now. That absence of urgency is itself a form of warmth. You let that understanding carry you gently forward. Winter has shown you that survival is often about knowing when not to move. And in that stillness you find rest, clarity, and a quiet confidence that tomorrow can wait until it is ready to be met. Your awareness settles lower now, down toward the feet, because frontier families learned that winter often announced failure there first. Feet carried weight, absorbed moisture, and cooled faster than the rest of the body. When feet failed, everything else followed. You feel that truth instinctively, the way cold creeps upward quietly if ignored. A firmly established pattern in winter travel records shows that foot injuries sidelined more people than storms accidents or encounters. Frostbite trenchfoot infected blisters rarely arrived suddenly. They developed from dampness, friction, and impatience. Small neglect became large consequence. People who understood this treated foot care as non-negotiable. You imagine the evening routine again, now focused downward. Boots are removed early before stiffness sets in. Insoles are pulled out and set where air can reach them without freezing solid. Socks are changed, even if they do not feel wet yet. Moisture hides, it always does. You feel how deliberate these actions are, slow and careful. There is a quietly ingenious practice mentioned in several family accounts. Some people stuffed boots loosely with dry grass cloth or paper overnight. This absorbed moisture and kept leather from collapsing inward as it stiffened. In the morning, boots were warmer and easier to put on. A small trick with outsized impact. Scholars continue to discuss whether frontier people truly understood circulation or whether they simply followed inherited habits. Either way, the results were clear. Warm, dry feet preserved balance, confidence, and speed. Cold feet dulled judgment and shortened days. You notice how socks were treated almost like tools. Wool preferred. Seams flattened carefully. Wrinkles smoothed out with fingertips. A fold at night became pain by morning. Pain caused hesitation. Hesitation cost heat. This chain was understood without explanation. There is a curious detail tucked into a few winter letters. Some travellers deliberately loosened boots before sleep, even if it felt counterintuitive. Restricted circulation chilled feet faster. Looser boots allowed blood flow and warmth retention. Comfort was sacrificed briefly for endurance later. One well-supported observation from domestic journals is that people warmed feet gradually, never abruptly. Thrusting cold feet directly toward high heat caused pain and sometimes injury. Instead, feet were warmed against the body first, then near gentle heat. Patience preserved tissue. You feel how this care extended into daytime habits. People avoided standing still unnecessarily. When they had to stop, they shifted weight, stamped lightly, kept blood moving without sweating. Movement was measured, not frantic. There is an oddly personal habit mentioned in some accounts. People learned the exact sensation of their feet when healthy. Any deviation raised attention. Numbness, tingling, stiffness, each meant something different. This sensory literacy prevented serious injury. Historians still debate how much foot care knowledge spread through formal advice versus quiet imitation. The evidence leans toward imitation. People watched how veterans treated their boots and copied them. Winter selected teachers harshly. You imagine children being taught to care for their feet early, not with lectures but routine. Change socks, hang them properly, feel for dampness. These habits became automatic long before danger was understood intellectually. There is a quirky practice recorded in a few northern settlements. Some families rotated socks between people at night, warming them with body heat before use. It sounds strange, but it ensured dry warmth when supplies were limited. Necessity reshaped norms. You notice how boots were positioned near warmth, but not close enough to overheat. Leather dried slowly, too fast and it cracked. Cracked boots leaked. Leaks stole heat relentlessly. Footwear demanded patience equal to fire management. One mainstream observation from frontier correspondents is that people often judged whether to travel the next day by how their feet felt at dawn. Sore or cold feet meant delay. Healthy feet meant options remained open. The feet decided. You feel how modern life hides this awareness. Insulated floors, central heating, synthetic materials. Out here, the body provided constant feedback. Ignoring it invited winter to intervene. There is an understated emotional component to foot care. Pain in the feet eroded morale faster than cold hands. When feet hurt, every step felt like a burden. Protecting them preserved optimism as much as mobility. You sit still and imagine flexing toes inside dry wool warmth slowly returning. That sensation feels deeply reassuring. It signals readiness. It means the day's demands can be met without hesitation. Some scholars continue to examine whether foot-related injuries influenced migration patterns more than we realize. People who lost mobility were often forced to settle permanently. Winter shaped population flow, quietly one step at a time. As the night deepens, feet rest where warmth is steady. Boots wait prepared for morning. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels neglected. You breathe slowly, letting that care extend upward through the body. The knowledge that your foundation is secure allows the rest to relax. Winter remains demanding, but it has lost another avenue of surprise. The feet are ready, and because of that, so is everything else. You let that certainty settle gently as sleep draws closer. Frontier families understood that survival often came down to the smallest points of contact with the world. Feet met the ground, care met cold, and through that careful attention, journeys continued one warm, steady step at a time. You start to think about tools now, not as objects of power, but as extensions of memory. In winter darkness, vision became unreliable. Hands took over. Frontier families arranged their tools so the body could find them without thinking. This was not tidiness. It was survival through familiarity. You feel that instinct rise as the light fades and the room settles into shadow. A well-supported reality found in winter camp descriptions is that experienced travelers place tools in the same configuration every single night, regardless of exhaustion. Knife here, hatchet there, rifle angled just so. Consistency mattered more than convenience. In darkness, muscle memory replaced sight and searching wasted warmth. You imagine lying still, arms sliding out from under blankets, just long enough to confirm what you already know. Wood, leather, metal. Each texture reports its presence instantly. You do not grasp anything. You simply verify. Then your hand returns to warmth. That brief check costs little and buys peace. There is a surprisingly clever habit mentioned in a handful of frontier letters. Some people oriented tool handles deliberately so they could tell which object they were touching by angle alone. A round grip meant one thing, a flat spine meant another. This allowed identification without lifting or adjusting. Winter rewarded this kind of precision. Researchers continue to examine whether such habits emerged from military influence, hunting culture, or sheer necessity. The evidence suggests all three played roles. What unites the accounts is how quickly disorganization punished people. A dropped tool in snow disappeared instantly. Finding it again cost time and heat. You notice how tools were kept close but not cluttered. Too many objects nearby increased confusion. Too few increased reach. The balance was learned. People trimmed what they carried in winter, favouring familiarity over variety. One trusted knife beat 3 unfamiliar ones. There is an understated but important observation from settlement records. People who fumbled tools in winter nights often reported panic afterward, even if no real danger followed. Panic lingered. It affected sleep. It burned warmth. Tool familiarity reduced that cascade. You feel how modern lighting has erased much of this awareness. Switches banish darkness instantly. Out here, light was precious and often minimal. Shadows dominated. Tools had to be found by feel. The body adapted. A quirky detail appears in some winter camps. People sometimes tied short cords to critical tools, anchoring them to a fixed point, not to secure them permanently, but to prevent loss if dropped. A simple tether saved countless minutes of cold searching. Scholars still debate how much of this arrangement culture spread between families versus developed independently. The similarity across distant regions suggests convergent solutions. Winter pushed everyone toward the same conclusions. You notice how tools were rarely put away carelessly after use. Each return reinforced memory. The act of placing a knife back where it belonged was as important as using it. Habit strengthened reliability. There is also the matter of sound. Metal clinking against metal carried farther in cold air. Quiet handling mattered. People learned to move tools softly at night, avoiding sudden noise that startled animals or woke others. Silence preserved calm. One mainstream observation from frontier correspondents is that nighttime emergencies were rarer than morning ones, partly because tools were already where they needed to be. Morning chaos caused accidents. Night discipline prevented them. You imagine a sudden need to adjust the fire. No scrambling. No sitting up abruptly. The poker is where it always is. A small adjustment is made. You settle again. Sleep resumes. That ease mattered deeply. There is a curious anecdote in a trapper's journal, describing how he once rearranged his tools after a long day and woke disoriented in the night, unable to find anything. He wrote that he never did it again. One mistake taught a lasting lesson. Some historians continue to question whether this level of order contradicted the stereotype of frontier life as rough and chaotic. The evidence suggests the opposite. The harsher the environment, the more disciplined routines became. You feel how this discipline extended beyond tools. Clothing, food, bedding, everything had a place, because everything might be needed half asleep. The night did not forgive confusion. You shift slightly and imagine reaching again. The floor is where you expect it. The wall meets your hand exactly where memory says it should. This spatial certainty calms the nervous system. Uncertainty burns energy. There is an emotional comfort in knowing that if something requires action, your hands will know what to do before your mind fully wakes. Frontier families valued that reassurance. It allowed deeper rest between check-ins. You realize how much trust was placed in repetition. Doing things the same way every night built reliability. Novelty was reserved for summer. Winter demanded predictability. One lesser discussed but important habit involved cleaning tools before sleep. Snow and moisture were wiped away. Metal dried. This prevented freezing and preserved function. A frozen tool in the morning could not be trusted. You imagine someone kneeling by the fire, quietly wiping a blade, then returning it to its place. No flourish, no pride, just maintenance. That quiet care extended the life of both tools and people. Researchers still explore how such habits influence later industrial work culture. The seeds of standardized process appear here, born not from efficiency alone, but from cold necessity. As the night deepens, tools rest where they belong. They are silent, ready, familiar. Their presence does not intrude on sleep. That is their success. You breathe slowly, letting that order settle into you. Nothing is misplaced. Nothing is forgotten. The body relaxes because it trusts its surroundings. Winter remains watchful, but it has been anticipated. The darkness feels less threatening when you know exactly what surrounds you. You drift again, aware that if something shifts, your hands will respond without hesitation. That knowledge is like another layer of insulation, thin but effective. And as sleep draws closer, You sense how much of frontier survival rested not in strength or speed, but in preparation, made habitual enough to disappear from conscious thought. Tools lie quiet, hands rest warm. The night continues steady and contained, and you move deeper into rest carried by the simple certainty that everything you might need is already waiting exactly where it should be. Your attention turns toward the women of the household now, not because they move louder or faster, but because so much of winter survival flowed quietly through their hands and decisions. Much of this knowledge never entered official records, yet it shaped outcomes every night. You sense how winter wisdom often lived in domestic space, dismissed by outsiders, and indispensable to those who endured. A widely acknowledged pattern in frontier communities is that women managed the systems that mattered most in cold weather: clothing care, food timing, fire rhythm, sleeping arrangements. These were not secondary tasks. They directly determined whether families stayed warm, dry, and functional. While men often travelled or worked outdoors, women controlled the environments where recovery happened. You notice how routines carried subtle authority. Decisions about when to eat, when to rest, when to add or remove layers. These were rarely debated. They were trusted. Winter punished indecision. Experience replaced argument. There is a small but telling detail preserved in some letters and memoirs. Women often adjusted household routines without announcing the change. A fire banked differently, extra socks placed where hands would find them, a child redirected to a warmer task. These shifts happened quietly, preventing problems before anyone named them. Prevention rarely leaves evidence. Researchers still examine how much frontier domestic knowledge was shared across households versus passed down privately. Some argue that women exchanged techniques during visits and communal work. Others suggest that competitive survival limited openness. The truth likely varied. What remains clear is that this knowledge travelled even when credit did not. You realise how domestic labour required constant environmental reading. Moisture levels, draft behaviour, body cues, food needs. These factors shifted daily. Women adjusted accordingly, often without language, to describe the calculus involved. Winter rewarded intuition, sharpened by repetition. There is a quirky anecdote tucked into a prairie memoir, describing how one woman could tell the next day's weather by how bread dough behaved overnight. Faster rising meant pressure changes. Slower fermentation meant deeper cold. Whether perfectly accurate or not, the observation guided preparation. Food became forecast. You feel how this kind of attention blurred lines between labour and awareness. Domestic space was not passive. It was monitored constantly. Floors were felt with bare feet, air tested with skin, heat evaluated by breath. This sensory engagement created resilience. One well-supported observation from settlement correspondence is that households with strong domestic routines experience fewer winter crises even when external conditions were similar. The difference lay not in resources alone, but in management. Order preserved energy. Energy preserved life. You notice how women often controlled repair as well, mending clothing, stuffing gaps, reinforcing bedding. These tasks required patience and foresight. A loose seam fixed early prevented a cold night later. Winter rewarded maintenance. There is a lesser-known practice mentioned in a few family stories. Some women deliberately rotated bedding layers between nights, drying one set while using another. This prevented moisture buildup that could chill sleepers. It required effort, but it stabilized warmth across long cold spells. Scholars continue to debate why such domestic knowledge was underrepresented in historical accounts. Literacy patterns, gender bias, perceptions of importance, all played roles. What survived were hints rather than manuals. Yet those hints reveal how central this work was. You sense how emotional regulation also fell largely within domestic care. Keeping voices calm, avoiding unnecessary conflict, reducing stress. Stress burned warmth faster than cold. A peaceful household conserved energy in ways rarely measured. There is a poignant detail in some winter diaries. Women often noted not their own discomfort, but the comfort of others. Who slept well? Who ate enough? who needed extra layers, care flowed outward. Winter survival was collective. You notice how this knowledge extended to children's education. Lessons were woven into tasks rather than delivered as instruction. Watch how this is done. Feel when it is right. The teaching was embodied, not explained. One mainstream observation from frontier life is that households led by experienced women fared better during extended winters, regardless of income or location. Experience mattered more than strength or ambition. Quiet competence outperformed bravado. You feel a slow respect settling in. These women were not passive figures waiting out winter. They were active managers of complex systems under constant pressure. Their work was invisible precisely because it succeeded. There is a curious habit mentioned in a few letters that feels almost ceremonial. Some women lit the evening lamp only after final adjustments were made. Light marked readiness. Until then, tasks continued. The lamp signaled that the household was prepared for night, a small ritual of completion. Researchers still examine whether similar domestic strategies appeared in other harsh climates globally. Parallels suggest universal patterns. When cold demands attention, domestic wisdom rises in importance. You imagine the quiet of evening after everything has been set. Fires steady, clothes arranged, food stored, beds prepared. The sense of order is palpable. It calms everyone without explanation. You realize how modern narratives of frontier survival often focus on dramatic moments, storms, blizzards, journeys. But winter was mostly endured through nights like this, shaped by unseen hands, making small, correct choices. As the night deepens, that quiet competence surrounds you. You feel held by systems you did not build but benefit from. The warmth feels intentional, not accidental. You let that awareness soften your thoughts. Winter survival was never a solo achievement. It was sustained by care that rarely announced itself. Breathing slows, muscles relax. The household rests, not because winter has passed, but because it has been managed thoughtfully. And in that calm, you sense how much of frontier resilience lived in places history often overlooked. Not in bold actions, but in steady attention. Not in loud decisions, but in quiet ones that made the cold lose its edge night after night. Your thoughts drift outward now beyond the household, toward knowledge that did not originate on the frontier at all. Many of the cold weather practices you have been absorbing arrived quietly from indigenous communities who had lived with these winters for generations. Borrowing happened without ceremony. Survival erased pride quickly. You feel that humility now, the sense that winter does not care where wisdom comes from. A well-supported reality from early settlement histories is that many frontier families adopted indigenous techniques for winter living even when they did not openly acknowledge doing so. Shelter placement, clothing materials, snow management, travel timing. These practices spread because they worked. People paid attention to results, not origin stories. You imagine watching how indigenous guides moved across snow, their steps light, measured, efficient. They did not fight the surface, they read it. Settlers who followed learned quickly which crusts held weight and which broke. Snowshoes, initially dismissed by some newcomers, became indispensable once understood. Winter corrected skepticism faster than argument. There is a fascinating detail mentioned in several trading post records. Some settlers learned to use inner bark grasses or moss as insulation in boots and bedding, a technique drawn directly from indigenous practice. These materials managed moisture remarkably well. They were replaced frequently, dried easily, and outperformed some woven fabrics. You picture hands gathering soft plant matter even in cold, knowing its value. Researchers continue to explore how much indigenous winter knowledge was shared willingly versus taken quietly. The record is uneven. What stands out is that the knowledge moved regardless. Winter created urgency. Techniques spread because lives depended on them. You notice how indigenous approaches often emphasized flexibility rather than fixed structures. Temporary windbreaks, adjustable shelters, movable insulation. This contrasted with settler instincts to build permanent solutions. Over time, many families blended both approaches. Rigid walls paired with adaptable layers. The combination proved resilient. One widely observed pattern from early expedition accounts is that groups travelling with indigenous guides suffered fewer cold-related losses than those who travelled alone. This was not luck. It reflected a different relationship with the environment. Winter was read continuously, not confronted episodically. There is a quirky but telling habit described in a fur trader's journal. Indigenous companions advised against clearing snow completely from camp areas, explaining that snow moderated temperature and reduced wind. Settlers initially resisted equating cleanliness with safety. After experiencing warmer nights, they stopped arguing. Experience settled the debate. You feel how indigenous knowledge often focused on reducing effort. Movement was efficient, gestures economical, heat conserved through calm. This contrasted with settler tendencies toward overexertion. Over time, those tendencies softened. Winter demanded restraint. Scholars still debate how much of this knowledge transfer was acknowledged in later narratives. Many frontier memoirs present techniques as discoveries rather than adaptations. The land becomes the teacher, conveniently obscuring human sources. The truth is more complex. You notice how food practices shifted as well. Use of fats, timing of meals, selection of preserved foods. Indigenous diets informed settler survival during harsh winters when imported supplies failed. Knowledge crossed cultural lines quietly through kitchens and camps. There is a lesser-known detail in some missionary accounts. Indigenous communities often advise settlers to rest more during extreme cold rather than push productivity. Rest was not laziness, it was alignment with season. Those who listened conserved strength for spring. You realize how deeply this challenged European ideas of progress and industry. Winter redefined productivity as endurance. Learning when not to act became as important as knowing how. One accepted observation from northern settlements is that clothing styles gradually shifted to resemble indigenous designs more closely. Wider sleeves, layered wraps, fur placement. These changes were not fashion statements, they were corrections. You feel how this borrowing required humility. Accepting advice meant admitting ignorance. Winter rewarded that humility generously. Those who refused often disappeared from records. There is a poignant detail in a few accounts describing settlers who could not articulate why certain practices worked only that indigenous neighbours had insisted. Trust replaced understanding. Survival did not require explanation. Some historians continue to examine whether this knowledge exchange influenced broader cultural attitudes or remained confined to survival contexts. The evidence suggests it remained largely practical, rarely acknowledged publicly. Yet its impact was profound. You imagine sitting by a fire, listening rather than speaking, watching how someone else arranges bedding positions, shelter reads wind. Learning happens without instruction. Winter accelerates education. You notice how this challenges modern ideas of ownership of knowledge. Techniques belong to the land as much as to people. Those who listened learned, those who ignored suffered. There is also an emotional dimension. Learning from others reduced isolation. Winter felt less hostile when shared understanding existed. Community extended beyond family. You feel that sense of connection now, stretching across generations and cultures. Cold wisdom did not belong to one group. It accumulated where people paid attention. As the night deepens, these borrowed practices blend seamlessly into the household routines you have already witnessed. No one pauses to label them. They are simply what is done. You breathe slowly, appreciating how survival knowledge often travels quietly, uncredited but persistent. Winter does not reward authorship, it rewards accuracy. You let that awareness settle. The house holds warmth through layers of learning, built across cultures. Snow, wind, fire, and food all managed with techniques refined long before the frontier existed. As sleep draws closer, you sense how this shared wisdom continues to echo forward. It lives in habits rather than books, in choices rather than speeches. And in that quiet inheritance you find a deep calm. Winter has been met not by force but by listening, and that listening learned from many voices carries you gently into rest held by knowledge older than the walls around you. You begin to notice how memories of mistakes linger longer than memories of storms. Frontier families spoke less about blizzards and more about the small decisions that went wrong before or after them. Winter did not always teach through spectacle. Often, it instructed through quiet regret that followed a choice made too quickly or carelessly. You feel that weight now, the seriousness that comes from knowing how small errors echo. A frequently noted reality in Frontier correspondence is that personal failures were remembered in precise detail. A door left unblocked, a sock not changed, a fire banked poorly. These moments were replayed internally long after the cold had passed. Storms felt external. Mistakes felt personal. People learned more from the latter. You imagine someone sitting near the fire, years later, retelling not the night the temperature dropped dangerously low, but the night they ignored a draft because they were tired. The lesson was not framed dramatically. It was offered quietly, almost as a confession. Those listening absorbed it carefully. Winter education often arrived through stories of error rather than success. There is a revealing pattern in winter diaries. Writers often recorded what they would do differently next time, even when the outcome had been survivable. This habit of reflection sharpened judgment over years. Winter punished complacency. Memory preserved caution. Researchers still examine whether this focus on mistake retention shaped frontier psychology more broadly. Some suggest it fostered humility. Others argue it heightened anxiety. The balance likely depended on temperament. What remains consistent is that mistakes were not forgotten easily. You notice how families built systems specifically to prevent known errors from repeating. If boots froze once, they were stored differently forever after. If water spilled and froze dangerously, containers were repositioned. These corrections became permanent features of routine. Winter turned experience into architecture. There is a curious detail found in a few personal accounts. Some people deliberately repeated tasks mentally before sleep, reviewing the evening for oversights. This was not worry, it was inventory. What had been done, what needed adjustment. That quiet rehearsal reduced surprises. You feel how calming that could be when done gently. One well-documented observation from settlement histories is that communities shared stories of failure more readily than stories of success. Success felt ordinary, failure felt instructive. Listening to others' mistakes allowed learning without direct cost. Winter rewarded attention to these narratives. You realize how different this is from modern storytelling, which often celebrates triumph. On the frontier, survival favored caution over pride. Stories warned rather than inspired. They created boundaries around behavior. There is a lesser-known but telling habit mentioned in some families. Parents sometimes deliberately allowed older children to make small, safe mistakes under supervision. Forgetting mittens briefly, standing too long without moving, then correcting gently. These controlled failures taught respect for cold without trauma. Scholars continue to debate whether frontier life produced a culture of fear or a culture of respect. The evidence suggests respect. Fear paralyzes, respect motivates preparation. Mistakes taught where the line was. You notice how regret was managed carefully. Dwelling too long burned energy. People acknowledged mistakes, corrected them, and moved on. Winter did not allow rumination. The focus stayed forward. There is an understated but powerful detail in some winter letters. Writers often described relief not when storms ended, but when routines held despite them. That relief came from knowing mistakes had been avoided. Prevention felt like victory. You imagine a family waking after a harsh night and realizing everything worked. Boots flexible, fire alive, bodies warm. No one celebrates. They simply note the absence of failure. That quiet success mattered deeply. One widely accepted observation from frontier narratives is that winter wisdom accumulated unevenly. A single mistake could teach a lesson that changed behavior for decades. Other lessons took years to surface. Experience layered slowly. You feel how this perspective reframes hardship. Winter was not an enemy to defeat, but a teacher that demanded attention. Mistakes were not punishments. They were feedback. Ignoring feedback escalated consequences. There is a quirky anecdote in a trapper's memoir describing how he kept a list of his winter mistakes, mentally calling it his cold ledger. He claimed it saved his life more than once. Whether literal or figurative, the idea resonates. Memory became a tool. Some historians continue to explore whether the emphasis on mistake memory contributed to frontier conservatism in later life. People who survived harsh winters often remained cautious even in comfort. Habits outlived necessity. You notice how this conservatism appears in small ways. Extra layers worn longer than needed, fires banked earlier than necessary, food saved even when plentiful. These behaviours carried the imprint of past winters. There is also a communal aspect. When one person made a mistake, others adjusted. A neighbour's misfortune became a lesson shared. This spread knowledge efficiently. Winter encouraged collective learning. You feel how humility underlies all of this. Admitting error without shame allowed improvement. Denial invited repetition. Frontier culture at its best valued correction over ego. But you imagine sitting quietly as someone older describes a winter-long past. The story focuses on what went wrong, not how brave they were. That honesty builds trust. You listen carefully. As the night deepens, you sense how this accumulated memory creates confidence. Not reckless confidence, but grounded assurance. You know what not to do. That knowledge narrows risk. You breathe slowly, letting that perspective settle. Mistakes are not erased by sleep, but they are integrated. They become part of the system that keeps you safe. Winter remains demanding, but it is predictable when listened to. Each error teaches boundaries. Each correction strengthens routine. You let that understanding soften your thoughts. The night feels steadier, knowing that even past failures have been put to work, transformed into guidance. As you drift toward rest, you carry with you the quiet truth frontier families learn deeply. Survival was built, not on perfection, but on remembering where you once went wrong and choosing differently the next time. That memory carefully held warmed nights long after the cold had passed. You begin to sense how warmth extended beyond fireplaces and blankets into something less tangible but just as vital. Community itself became insulation. Frontier families rarely survived winter entirely alone, even when houses stood far apart. Support moved quietly between people, carried by habit, obligation, and shared understanding. You feel how proximity, even occasional, softened winter's edge. A well-documented pattern in frontier settlements is that households clustered closer together over time, especially after severe winters. Isolated cabins were relocated, shared windbreaks were built, paths between homes were maintained, even when travel elsewhere stopped. These choices were not social preferences alone. They reduced risk, help arrived faster, resources stretched further. You imagine neighbours visiting briefly at dusk, not for conversation, but to check conditions. A glance at a woodpile, a comment on smoke behaviour, a shared observation about wind. These exchanges carried information as much as goodwill. Winter knowledge flowed along these informal lines. There is a curious detail mentioned in several settlement letters. Some communities arranged winter labour, so no one household bore the hardest tasks alone. Fuel cutting rotated, animal care shared. This prevented exhaustion in any one family. The cold punished fatigue mercilessly. Shared effort preserved strength. Researchers still examine how these cooperative patterns formed. Some argue they arose from cultural traditions brought by settlers. Others believe winter itself forced collaboration regardless of background. The evidence suggests that cold erased ideological boundaries quickly. Cooperation became practical. You notice how warmth was sometimes literal. During extreme cold, families occasionally slept together in larger groups, sharing heat across households. This was not common, but it happened when necessary. Pride yielded to physics. Survival outweighed privacy. One widely accepted observation from frontier diaries is that communities with stronger mutual aid experience fewer winter fatalities. Even small gestures mattered. Sharing a pot of stew, lending dry socks, watching children while someone rested. These acts prevented cascading failures. You feel how communication itself provided warmth. Knowing someone else was aware of your situation reduced anxiety. Anxiety burned energy. Calm conserved it. Winter rewarded emotional stability. There is a quirky but touching habit described in a few rural memoirs. Some neighbours left small signs after visiting. A stick leaned a certain way, a stone moved. These signals indicated all was well. They spared unnecessary travel and reassured without words. Scholars continue to debate whether frontier communities were inherently cooperative or whether winter selectively preserved cooperative groups. The outcome looks the same from a distance. Groups that worked together endured. Those that fractured struggled. You notice how shared routines developed. Fires banked around the same time. Meals eaten at similar hours. Work paused collectively during storms. Synchronization reduced risk. People looked out for one another because their rhythms aligned. There is an understated detail in some winter correspondence. People often described feeling colder when alone, even if physical conditions were unchanged. The presence of others provided reassurance that affected perception of cold. Warmth was partly psychological. You imagine a long winter evening with quiet company. No one speaks much. Someone mends. Someone feeds the fire. Someone watches children. The room feels fuller, warmer. Bodies share space. Heat pools naturally. One mainstream observation from settlement records is that communities often gathered for shared meals during winter more frequently than in other seasons. Food stretched further when cooked together. Fuel was saved. Companionship eased monotony. Efficiency and morale intertwined. You feel how winter softened individualism. Self-reliance remained important, but mutual dependence became visible. People did not frame it as charity. It was reciprocity. Today you help, tomorrow you might need it. There is a lesser-known practice mentioned in a few accounts. Some communities designated a winter watcher, someone who checked on households during severe cold. This role rotated. It prevented tragedies from going unnoticed. Quiet vigilance saved lives. Historians still debate whether these roles formalized later into civic structures. What is clear is that the seeds of community organization often grew out of winter necessity. You notice how children learned this communal mindset early. They were sent with small messages, small bundles, small tasks. Participation taught responsibility and connection. Winter survival became collective identity. You imagine the relief of hearing a knock during a long cold spell. Not alarm, just presence. Someone checking in. That sound alone could lift spirits and conserve energy. There is also the matter of shared knowledge. One family's discovery spread quickly. A better way to store fuel, a trick for drying boots. Winter accelerated information exchange. The environment demanded it. You feel how community reduced fear of the unknown. When many eyes watched, condition surprises diminished. Winter became manageable through shared awareness. As the night deepens, you sense that warmth does not belong solely to fire or clothing. It circulates between people through cooperation and care. Frontier families survived not just because they were prepared, but because they were connected. You breathe slowly, letting that realization settle. Isolation feels colder now by comparison. Togetherness feels efficient, grounding, safe. Outside, snow continues its quiet accumulation. Inside, the presence of others anchors the space. Even when alone, the knowledge that others exist nearby provides comfort. You drift gently onward, understanding that winter survival was never an individual achievement. It was a network of shared decisions, shared effort, shared vigilance. And in that shared warmth, nights passed more easily, carrying communities through seasons that might otherwise have broken them apart. You begin to notice how fear itself was treated as something to be managed, not eliminated. Frontier families understood that winter did not require bravery so much as steadiness. Panic burned energy, anxiety shortened attention, calm preserved warmth and judgment. You feel that principle settling now, the way slow breathing changes everything without effort. A well-attested reality in frontier journals is that people who panicked during cold emergencies often made situations worse, even when help or shelter was close. Rushing caused sweating. Poor decisions followed. In contrast, those who slowed themselves deliberately survived conditions that should have overwhelmed them. Emotional control became a practical skill. You imagine waking suddenly in the night, heart racing for no clear reason. The response is not to jump up. Jumping exposes the core and disrupts insulation. Instead, people learn to pause, assess quietly, and let the body settle. Is the fire still breathing? Are limbs responsive? Is the wind different? These checks happened internally before any movement. There is a small but revealing habit mentioned in several personal accounts. Some people deliberately counted breaths when startled awake in winter, not for meditation, but regulation. Counting slowed respiration, reduced shivering, triggered by adrenaline, and restored warmth. It was a simple technique with measurable effect. Researchers still discuss whether such emotional discipline was taught intentionally or learned through consequence. Evidence suggests it emerged organically. People noticed that staying calm kept them warmer. Cold provided immediate feedback. You feel how fear was reframed as information rather than alarm. A sense of unease prompted review, not flight. This distinction mattered. Winter punished impulsive action more than delayed response. One widely recognized observation from settlement letters is that experienced winter travelers rarely described fear directly. They described assessment, conditions, decisions. The emotional content was subdued. This does not mean fear was absent, it means it was contained. You notice how language itself shifted. People spoke in practical terms rather than dramatic ones. Instead of danger, they said conditions were unfavorable. Instead of panic, they said they waited. Words shaped response. Calm language supported calm action. There is a quirky but effective practice mentioned in a few accounts. Some families sang softly or hummed during particularly tense winter nights. Not to pass time, but to regulate breathing and maintain rhythm. Sound anchored calm, silence could amplify anxiety, controlled noise steadied nerves. Scholars continue to examine whether frontier emotional restraint influenced later cultural norms around Stoicism. The connection is debated. What is clear is that emotional excess carried physical cost in cold environments. You feel how this restraint did not mean suppression. People acknowledged fear internally. They simply did not let it dictate action. Winter demanded clarity, not denial. You imagine a storm intensifying outside, wind rising, snow thickening. Inside, movements slow further, voices lower. Tasks become deliberate. No one rushes. This atmosphere itself conserves heat. One well-supported observation from winter narratives is that families often prepared mentally for emergencies during calm periods. They imagined responses without urgency. This rehearsal reduced surprise later. Surprise wasted time. Time cost warmth. You notice how children absorbed this emotional discipline too. Adults modeled calm responses. Children mirrored them. Panic was rarely displayed openly. This taught regulation early without explanation. There is a lesser-known detail in a few frontier memoirs. Some people deliberately avoided discussing worst-case scenarios during winter nights, not out of denial, but to prevent unnecessary stress. Planning happened earlier, night was for rest. Historians still debate whether this emotional management came at a psychological cost. Did people carry unexpressed fear long-term? The records do not answer cleanly. What they do show is survival through composure. You feel how calm became contagious. One steady person influenced others. Group regulation mattered. Winter crises were less likely to escalate when someone remained grounded. There is an understated lesson here. Courage in winter was quiet. It looked like waiting, like breathing slowly, like making small adjustments without drama. This kind of courage left no stories, but it saved lives. You sit with that understanding now. Fear does not disappear. It settles into the background, informing without overwhelming. That balance feels achievable, even comforting. Outside, the cold continues its pressure. Inside, nothing escalates. The body remains warm. The mind remains clear. You breathe slowly again, noticing how warmth holds when movement is minimal and thoughts are steady. The house feels stable. The night feels legible. As sleep draws closer, you realize how much frontier survival depended on this inner skill. Not fighting fear, but pacing it, letting it alert without allowing it to rule. You let that realization soften you. The night does not feel threatening now. It feels demanding but manageable. Calm has become another layer of insulation. And as you drift further into rest, you carry with you the quiet frontier lesson that fear, like cold, is best met with attention, patience, and deliberate calm. In that steadiness, warmth lasts longer, judgment stays sharp, and the long winter night passes without stealing more than it should. Your thoughts begin to stretch forward, now beyond this single night, toward the way winter shaped people long after it ended. Frontier children who grew up inside these routines carried them quietly into adulthood. Cold seasons did not stay behind as memories. They settled into posture habits, instincts. You feel that inheritance now, the sense that winter leaves marks that never fully fade. A well-documented observation in later census records and memoirs is that adults who survived multiple frontier winters behaved differently for the rest of their lives. They dressed conservatively. They prepared early. They noticed wind and light instinctively. Even when they moved to towns or warmer regions, these habits persisted. Winter had rewired their sense of normal. You imagine a grown child leaving the frontier, years later, stepping into a house with thick walls and steady heat. Others relax immediately. They do not. They still check drafts. They still place boots carefully. They still feel uneasy if food is scarce at night. These habits are not anxiety. They are memory embodied. There is a revealing detail mentioned in several family histories. People who grew up in harsh winters often struggled to sleep deeply in overly warm rooms. Heat without variation felt wrong. They preferred cooler air and heavier blankets. Their bodies remembered balance, not excess. Researchers continue to debate whether this carried over knowledge constituted resilience or lingering stress. Some interpret it as hypervigilance, others see it as adaptive intelligence. The distinction may depend on context. What helped in winter could feel unnecessary elsewhere, yet the habits remained because they once mattered deeply. You notice how this inheritance shaped parenting. Adults taught their children lessons they themselves had learned young. Change socks, listen to the house, prepare the night before. These instructions were given even when winters were milder. Wisdom outlived necessity. There is a quietly charming anecdote in a late 19th century memoir describing an elderly woman who still banked her fire carefully every night, long after central heating arrived. When asked why, she said she slept better, knowing it was done. The habit itself provided comfort. One widely accepted pattern in migration studies is that families from colder frontier regions adapted more easily to new hardships elsewhere. Their tolerance for uncertainty was higher, their patience longer. Winter had trained them in delayed reward and preparation. You feel how winter also shaped values. Waste felt dangerous, excess felt uncomfortable. Saving became instinctive. People who lived through scarcity rarely embraced abundance casually. They measured comfort differently. There is a lesser-known detail in some oral histories. Older frontier survivors often disliked sudden changes to routine, even benign ones. Routine had once been protective. Disruption felt risky. Stability equaled safety. Scholars still examine how these traits influenced later community building. Many frontier-trained adults became cautious leaders, emphasizing preparation over expansion. Their decisions reflected winter logic applied to new contexts. You imagine someone decades later watching a storm through a window, feeling a familiar tightening in the chest. They check supplies reflexively, even if the storm poses little risk. The body remembers what the mind knows is unnecessary. You notice how children raised by such adults absorbed this caution indirectly. They learned preparedness without experiencing the original threat. Knowledge traveled forward without the environment that produced it. There is a poignant truth here. Winter wisdom often outlives winter itself. The habits remain even when the danger fades. This can look excessive to outsiders. To those who lived it, it feels prudent. One mainstream observation from social histories is that frontier families placed high value on self-sufficiency long after moving into communities. They trusted their own preparation more than external systems. Winter had taught them that help might not arrive. You feel how this mindset carries both strength and burden. It creates resilience. It can also make rest difficult. Letting go feels unsafe when vigilance once meant survival. There is an understated practice mentioned in some later letters. Former frontier families often maintained winter routines symbolically, lighting lamps at certain times, laying out clothes carefully. These rituals anchored identity. Researchers continue to explore whether these inherited habits influence cultural attitudes toward weather more broadly. In many regions, winter still carries moral weight. Preparation is praised, neglect criticized. These values echo frontier experience. You imagine yourself carrying some of these habits forward even now, listening to wind, laying things out carefully, valuing calm preparation. They feel grounding rather than burdensome. There is comfort in understanding where these instincts come from. They are not quirks, they are echoes of survival. As the night deepens further, you feel connected, not just to this moment, but to generations who learned similar lessons under similar conditions. Their habits flow quietly into yours. You breathe slowly, letting that continuity settle. Winter is not just a season, it is a teacher whose lessons persist long after the classroom closes. You allow yourself to rest in that understanding. The night feels rich with memory, layered with lives lived attentively. The cold outside is real, but inside knowledge provides warmth that time cannot erode. And as sleep moves closer, you sense how frontier winter wisdom continues to live on, shaping choices in subtle ways, reminding those who inherit it to prepare gently, notice quietly, and trust the systems that once kept entire families alive. Through the longest, coldest nights, you start to sense what was lost, as much as what was gained when modern comforts arrived. Central heating, sealed windows, electric light. These innovations changed winter profoundly, but they also erased skills that once felt ordinary. You feel that absence now, like a quiet forgetting. Frontier families did not just survive winter, they understood it. Modern life softened that relationship until many of its lessons faded. A broadly recognized historical shift occurred as permanent heating systems spread through homes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Fires became background appliances instead of living systems. Drafts disappeared behind insulation. Nights no longer required active management. Comfort increased. Awareness declined. Winter became something to endure passively rather than negotiate actively. You imagine the first time a family experienced steady, artificial warmth through the night. No waking to check the fire. No listening for wind changes. No laying out clothes with the same care. Sleep deepened. But something else loosened. Attention. That quiet vigilance that once guided survival no longer felt necessary. There is a revealing detail noted in early modernization diaries. Some people complained not of cold, but of unease. Rooms felt too still, air too flat. The absence of familiar cues created discomfort. People opened windows in winter seeking movement. The body missed information, even as it enjoyed warmth. Researchers continue to examine how quickly environmental awareness declined once systems replaced routine. Some argue the shift happened within a single generation. Others suggest fragments persisted longer in rural areas. What remains clear is that skills not practiced fade quickly, even when once essential. You notice how modern architecture discourages listening. Walls are thick, sound insulated, outside disappears. This protects comfort but reduces feedback. Frontier homes spoke constantly. Modern homes whisper or remain silent. The difference changes behavior. There is a quirky but telling habit described in early 20th century memoirs. Some older people continued to test the air with their skin, even in heated homes. They stood barefoot briefly on floors. They felt walls with their palms. They trusted sensation more than thermostats. Their children found it odd. The habit faded. One well-established observation from social history is that early heating failures caused disproportionate panic. People no longer knew how to manage cold actively. They waited for systems to be restored rather than adapting. Winter had shifted from partner to adversary. You feel how modern life trains dependency. When heat fails, anxiety spikes quickly. Frontier families faced cold as routine. Modern families face it as emergency. The difference lies not in toughness, but in familiarity. Scholars still debate whether this loss of skill matters in a world of reliable infrastructure. Some argue technology has made old knowledge obsolete. Others warn that reliance without understanding creates vulnerability. The discussion remains unsettled, especially as climate extremes increase. You imagine a winter power outage in a modern home, confusion, searching for flashlights, unsure how to block drafts, unsure how to dress effectively. Contrast that with the quiet competence you have been inhabiting. The difference feels stark. There is an understated lesson here. Convenience trades awareness for ease. Ease feels good until it disappears. Frontier families paid constant attention, so they did not have to panic when conditions changed. You notice how some winter habits persist unconsciously, even today. People cluster in certain rooms, lay blankets across doorways during outages, cook heavier meals. These instincts surface under stress. They are echoes, not innovations. There is a lesser-known detail from early urban histories. Some city dwellers with frontier backgrounds volunteered as informal winter advisors during harsh seasons. They taught neighbours how to insulate windows with cloth, how to manage fires safely, how to layer clothing. Old knowledge resurfaced when needed. Researchers continue to examine how cultural memory of winter survives without direct experience. Traditions, sayings, superstitions, these fragments hint at practices once widespread. The meaning often fades while the behaviour remains. You feel a quiet sadness in realising how much wisdom disappeared, not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer demanded. Winter no longer forced attention in the same way. The teacher left the room. There is also relief. Modern warmth saves lives. It reduces suffering. The loss is not simple, it is complicated. Comfort has value, but so does understanding. You imagine standing in a modern heated room during a storm, windows rattling faintly. You are warm, safe, and yet you feel disconnected from what the wind is doing. Frontier families would have known exactly how that wind moved across their walls. One mainstream observation from disaster studies is that communities with retained traditional knowledge recover faster when systems fail. Familiarity with cold management reduces shock. This suggests old wisdom still has relevance. You notice how this makes you listen differently, even now. You pay attention to drafts, to sound, to your own comfort shifting. That awareness feels grounding rather than alarming. There is a quirky practice revived occasionally by outdoor educators. They teach people to spend short periods without artificial heat, learning to manage warmth actively. Participants report increased confidence. The body remembers quickly. Scholars still debate whether reintroducing such skills broadly would benefit society or create unnecessary hardship. The answer likely depends on balance. Knowledge need not replace comfort, it can supplement it. You feel how frontier wisdom does not demand rejection of modern life. It asks for attentiveness, knowing what to do when systems fail, knowing how cold behaves. That knowledge reduces fear. As the night deepens, you sense how this forgotten wisdom stirs gently within you. Not as nostalgia, but as readiness. You do not wish for hardship, you simply respect its possibility. You breathe slowly, letting that respect settle. Winter no longer feels like an abstract threat. It feels like a set of conditions with rules that can be learned. You drift onward, understanding that modernization brought warmth, but it also asked us to forget. Remembering a little of what was lost does not mean going backward, it means being complete. And as sleep draws closer, you rest in the quiet realization that forgotten knowledge can be remembered when needed. Winter has not changed, only our relationship with it has. And tonight, listening closely, you feel that relationship gently reawakening, calm and steady, ready to carry you into whatever cold may come. You begin to notice how pieces of frontier winter wisdom still linger quietly in modern life, often unnoticed until conditions demand them. These habits surface instinctively, especially when systems falter or weather turns sharp. You feel it now, that subtle recognition that some responses feel older than your own experience, as if remembered by the body rather than the mind. A clearly observed pattern in contemporary disaster reports is that people often rediscover Basic cold management behaviors during power outages or severe storms. Families cluster into fewer rooms. Blankets appear across doorways. Cooking shifts to heavier, slower meals. These actions mirror frontier routines almost exactly. The knowledge was not taught explicitly. It emerged under pressure. You imagine a modern household during a winter blackout. Lights gone, heat silent. At first there is confusion. Then behavior changes. People move less. They dress in layers. They gather in the warmest space. They conserve phone batteries and energy alike. Without realizing it, they reenact lessons learned generations ago. Winter draws memory out of hiding. There is a small but revealing detail noted in several recent emergency response studies. Individuals with rural or cold climate upbringing tend to adapt more quickly during winter disruptions. They worry less and act sooner. Their preparation feels automatic. That difference suggests inherited or learned patterns still matter. Researchers continue to explore whether this resurgence of old habits represents cultural memory or individual improvisation. The distinction is difficult to draw. What matters is that the behaviors align closely with historical cold weather strategies. The body seems to remember what to do when comfort disappears. You notice how language still carries traces of this wisdom. Batten down, bundle up, keep the fire going. These phrases persist even when their original contexts fade. Words preserve habits long after the tools change. There is a quirky but telling modern parallel. During winter storms, people often cook large pots of soup or stew even when other options exist. The meal warms, slowly feeds many, and lasts. Few consciously connect this choice to frontier logic, yet the resemblance is striking. Warmth, efficiency, endurance. One well-supported observation from urban winter studies is that people instinctively avoid sweating indoors during cold outages. They remove layers briefly, then replace them. This mirrors frontier caution around moisture. The lesson resurfaces without instruction. You feel how attention sharpens when cold intrudes unexpectedly. You listen more closely to sounds in the house. You notice drafts. You become aware of your breathing. These responses feel natural, almost calming. The body switches modes. Scholars still debate whether modern society retains enough of this dormant knowledge to handle prolonged disruptions. Some argue technology has dulled adaptation. Others point to repeated evidence that people adjust rapidly when needed. The debate remains unresolved. You imagine someone blocking a window with towels during a storm, feeling oddly satisfied. The action feels right. It restores control. That satisfaction mirrors frontier experience. Small corrections feel powerful in cold conditions. There is an understated but important observation from social psychology. Regaining agency during environmental stress reduces anxiety more effectively than reassurance alone. Frontier routines provided agency. Modern rediscovery does the same. You notice how children often adapt fastest during these moments. They accept new routines easily. They curl under blankets. They play quietly. Their flexibility echoes frontier childhood. Less expectation means less frustration. There is a lesser-known detail from recent cold weather events. Communities often share resources, informally lending generators, sharing meals, checking on neighbours. These behaviours resemble frontier mutual aid patterns. Crisis revives cooperation. Historians continue to examine whether such behaviours indicate a deep cultural imprint or simply practical problem solving. Perhaps both are true. The patterns repeat because they work. You feel how this continuity bridges past and present. Frontier wisdom is not locked in museums. It lives quietly in behaviour, waiting for context. Cold provides that context reliably. You imagine an older neighbour offering advice during a storm. Use blankets over doors. Keep one room warm. Eat something heavy. The advice sounds old-fashioned. It is also correct. Knowledge flows forward, person to person, not book to book. There is a subtle, emotional comfort in recognizing this lineage. You are not inventing solutions alone. You are drawing from a deep reservoir shaped by generations who face the same cold. You notice how modern preparedness guides increasingly echo these older principles. Layering, insulation, calm assessment, they are framed as best practices, but they are inherited wisdom repackaged. There is also humility here. Technology can fail, winter cannot. Respecting that fact reduces shock when disruptions occur. You feel how these lessons integrate gently into your awareness now. Not as instructions, but as reassurance. You know what to do if needed. That knowledge reduces fear. As the night deepens, you sense how past and present align quietly. The cold outside behaves as it always has. The body responds as it always has. The difference lies in attention. You breathe slowly, appreciating how frontier wisdom has not vanished entirely. It waits in habits, phrases, instincts, ready to surface when conditions call for it. This realization feels grounding rather than alarming. It reminds you that humans have met winter successfully many times before, with far fewer tools than we possess now. You settle deeper into rest, comforted by the continuity. The night feels manageable because it has been managed countless times before by people whose lessons still echo forward. And as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you the quiet understanding that forgotten wisdom is never truly gone. It lives in the body and community, in simple actions, taken when cold demands respect. Winter still speaks the same language, and you are still able to listen. You feel the pace slow now, almost on its own, as if winter itself is easing its grip just enough to let you rest. After everything you have noticed tonight, you realize that cold was never something frontier families tried to silence. They let it speak, they listened, they adjusted. Over time, that conversation became familiar, even comforting. You are still inside it now, wrapped in layers of learned attention. A well-recognized conclusion, drawn from many frontier-era reflections, is that families who survived winter repeatedly stopped seeing it as an enemy. It became a condition with rules. Once those rules were understood, fear diminished. Cold still demanded effort, but it no longer surprised. Predictability replaced dread. You notice how this wisdom does not shout, it settles. Wind behaves a certain way. Snow does certain things. Bodies respond in predictable patterns. When you accept that winter stops feeling personal, it is not punishing you, it is simply being itself. There is a small but telling detail mentioned in several late frontier memoirs. Older settlers often wrote that they missed winter after leaving it behind. Not the hardship, but the clarity. Winter stripped life down to essentials. Warmth, food, shelter, attention. That simplicity left an impression that comfort alone could not replace. Researchers still discuss whether this nostalgia reflects genuine appreciation or selective memory. Perhaps both. What matters is that winter taught something enduring. It demanded presence. It rewarded preparation. It quieted unnecessary noise. You sense how this knowledge has been accumulating all night, not as facts, but as rhythm. How to move, when to stop, what to notice. These lessons feel less like history now, and more like instinct gently awakened. There is a quirky but gentle habit recorded in a few family traditions. At the end of the coldest season, some households performed a small ritual of thanks. Not religious necessarily, just acknowledgement. Winter had passed, lessons had been learned again. Survival was noted quietly. No celebration, just respect. One mainstream observation from historical climatology is that frontier winters were not uniformly harsher than today's. What differed was exposure. People lived closer to conditions. That closeness sharpened understanding. Distance dulled it. You feel how modern life buffers us from many signals. Tonight you have been letting those signals back in softly. Wind sound, fire rhythm, body sensation. None of it feels threatening. It feels grounding. Scholars continue to debate whether reconnecting with this kind of environmental awareness improves well-being. The evidence suggests that attention reduces anxiety. Understanding replaces fear. Winter wisdom becomes emotional insulation. You imagine standing at the edge of a long season, not rushing ahead, not bracing against it, just acknowledging it. That posture feels restful. Winter does not require tension, it requires respect. You notice how the house around you feels settled now. Sounds are familiar, air is still, fire breathes evenly, animals are calm, nothing is asking for action. This is the reward for attention paid earlier. There is an understated truth here. Most frontier nights ended like this, quietly, safely, without drama. History often remembers the storms. People remembered the calm. You breathe slowly, letting your thoughts stretch and soften. The cold outside continues its work, but it has lost its urgency. Everything that needed to be done has been done. And now, as promised, the story begins to fade into rest. The fire lowers itself, naturally, coals glowing without effort. Shadows lengthen but no longer shift. Your body feels heavy in the best way, supported. Insulated, unhurried. Breathing deepens. Each inhale feels warm. Each exhale feels released. You no longer need to listen actively. The night is stable. The systems are holding. Wind slides past without interest. Snow settles into place. The house knows how to keep you. Thoughts slow and stretch out, becoming softer, less defined. The lessons of winter drift with them, no longer instructional, just present. Attention becomes comfort. Knowledge becomes quiet confidence. Nothing more is required from you tonight. You are warm enough, safe enough, prepared enough. The long frontier night carries on, but you do not have to follow it anymore. You can let it pass without you, watched over by walls, fire, and generations of quiet wisdom that learned how to endure cold without fear. Your breathing evens out, muscles loosen. The last bits of alertness melt away like frost under early sun. Sleep arrives gently, not as an escape, but as part of the system that has always worked. And in that softness, wrapped in old understanding and present calm, you drift fully into rest. Sweet dreams.